Margaret Hayes set down the heavy salt barrel. 2 ranch hands had shoved into her arms, looked the foreman dead in the eye, and said the words nobody on Brooks Ranch ever expected to hear from a mail-order wife. "You don't need a woman to salt your beef. You need one to save this ranch before there's no beef left to salt." The men laughed. Nathan Brooks didn't, because the heavy widow no man in Wyoming had wanted to marry had just walked through his gate, asked to see his account book, before she'd even washed the trail dust off her hands, and found the one thing that was truly killing his cattle. And it wasn't the drought. If you believe a person's worth was never meant to be measured by the size of their body, stay with me to the very end of this story, because what this woman does will stay with you long after it's over. Subscribe to the channel. Follow Margaret's journey all the way through, and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from, so I can see just how far her story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the morning it all began. The advertisement Nathan Brooks placed in 3 territorial papers did not use the word love. It didn't use the word wife the way other men meant it either. Wanted, it read, a strong, hard-working woman to cook preserved meat and salt beef for the winter season. Marriage offered for honest labor. No frills, no promises. His foreman, a leather-faced man named Cyrus Doyle, read it back to him on the porch and spat into the dust. "You sure about this, Nathan?" "I'm sure about the winter contract, Cyrus. I'm sure I lose this ranch if that beef ain't cured and shipped by December." "That ain't what I asked." Nathan folded the paper. "It's the only thing I got the right to be sure about." Cyrus shook his head. "Your daddy didn't build this place so you could hire a wife like she was a second-hand at branding time. My daddy built this place," Nathan said low, "and my daddy's in the ground, and the bank don't care which of us is breathing. You want to keep your wages, you let me worry about how the beef gets salted." The letters came slow. 3 of them. 2 women changed their minds when they learned how far out the ranch sat, how the nearest town was a half-day's ride, how the herd had been thinned by fever the spring before. The 3rd letter came in a careful, even hand, and it asked questions the other 2 never had. How many head do you run? How many did you lose? What does your hay cost you, and who hauls it? Do you keep your breeding records, and may I see them? Cyrus laughed when Nathan read it aloud. "She wants your breeding records. What kind of woman asks a man about his breeding records before she's even seen his face?" "A serious one," Nathan said, and he didn't laugh. He wrote back. She answered. Her name was Margaret Hayes, widowed at 26. No children, raised on a hard-luck Kansas farm that her husband had run into the ground before a wagon spill put him in the earth. She did not lie about herself. She told him plainly in that same careful hand that she was a heavy woman, that men had made their opinions of that known to her for most of her life, and that if it would be a trouble to him he should say so now and save them both the train fare. Nathan read that part twice. Then he wrote, "I need work done and done right. I never asked the Lord for a wife built like a fence post, and I don't reckon he'd have sent me one if I had. Come if you're coming." She came. The first thing Cyrus said when the hired wagon rolled through the gate and Margaret climbed down was said under his breath, but not quiet enough. "Lord have mercy." He ordered a wife, and they sent him 2. The ranch hands by the corral heard it. They laughed. Margaret heard it too. She didn't flinch, didn't color, didn't drop her eyes the way the laughing men expected. She simply turned her head, found the one who'd laughed loudest, and looked at him until he stopped. "You'd be Mr. Doyle," she said to Cyrus. "Foreman Doyle. Foreman Doyle." She smoothed her traveling skirt. "I'll need someone to carry my trunk to the house. And I'll need to know which of these men can read, because I'll be needing one who can." Cyrus blinked. "Now hold on. You're here too." "I'm here," Margaret said, "to keep this ranch from going under. Mr. Brooks wrote me his contract numbers. I did the figuring on the train. Your 3 weeks of bad weather from losing the whole outfit and salting beef ain't going to fix that, no matter how good a hand I am with the brine." 2 hands carrying a feed sack between them stopped dead to listen. Nathan came out of the barn, then wiping his hands on a rag, and the first time he laid eyes on the woman he'd agreed to marry. He didn't say a word about her size at all. He looked at her face, at the steadiness in it, and something in him went quiet and watchful. "Miss Hayes." "Mr. Brooks." She put out her hand and shook his like a man would. "I've read your letters 6 times each. I'd like to see your books before supper if it's all the same to you." Cyrus laughed again. "She wants the books. First hour off the wagon and she—" "Cyrus." Nathan's voice cut him clean. "Get her trunk." The foreman's jaw worked, but he got the trunk. They were married 4 days later by a circuit preacher who came through on his way to Laramie. There was no celebration. There was a signature, a vow neither of them dressed up, and a supper of beans and salt pork that Margaret cooked better than anything that kitchen had turned out in 2 years. Nathan noticed that too. He noticed a great many things about her in those first days, and not one of them was the thing the ranch hands wouldn't stop snickering about. What he noticed most was that she didn't rest. The morning after the wedding, before the rooster, before Cyrus, before any of the hands had pulled on their boots, Margaret was already at the long table in the front room with Nathan's ledgers open and a stub of pencil in her hand. He found her there. "You been up all night?" "Most of it." She didn't look up. "Mr. Brooks, who told you your cattle were dying of bad luck?" "Everybody? The vet, the neighbors, the bank? They're wrong." She turned the ledger so he could see. "Sit down, I'll show you." He sat. "You lost 40 head to fever last spring," she said. "That's bad luck, I'll grant you. But look here." Her pencil tapped a column. "You bought hay from a man named Tillett at near twice what it's worth hauled from 40 miles off, when you've got a man named Aldous 12 miles up the creek selling the same grade for a third less." "Why?" "Tillett's been selling my daddy hay for 20 years. Tillett's been robbing your daddy for 20 years then." She moved her pencil. "And here, you sold off 11 breeding cows in March to make a bank payment. 11. You sold the future of your herd to pay a debt you could have stretched. I needed the cash. You needed a plan." She said it without cruelty, the way a doctor says a thing that's true. "And here's the one that matters most, Mr. Brooks. You're grazing. You run the same animals over the same ground season after season till there's nothing left for them to eat but dust. The grass never gets a chance to come back. Your land ain't cursed, it's exhausted. You've been working it to death the same way a man works a horse to death, and then standing there surprised when it lies down." Nathan stared at the columns, at the numbers, at the years. "My daddy ran it this way," he said finally. "And your daddy died owing the bank, didn't he?" It was a hard thing to say. She said it soft, but she said it. For a long moment, Nathan didn't answer. Then he pushed back from the table and walked to the window, and his shoulders had a set to them she'd learned to read in time, the set of a proud man, hearing a thing he doesn't want to be true. "You been on this ranch one night," he said, "and I've learned more about it from these books than you've let yourself see in 5 years. Because you've been too busy grieving your father and fighting the weather to do the arithmetic." She closed the ledger gently. "I'm not here to shame you, Mr. Brooks. I'm here because you put it in writing that you wanted work done right. This is the work. It just ain't the work you thought you were hiring me for." He turned around. "And if I let you do it, this figuring of yours, and it don't work, then you'll have lost a winter you were going to lose anyway." He couldn't argue that. By midday, it was all over the bunkhouse. The new wife was going through the books. The new wife told Cyrus the hayman was a thief. The new wife wanted the herd counted again, every head by sundown. "She's giving orders," a young hand named Pete said at the trough, half in wonder, "telling Cyrus how to run cattle." "She's a cook," another said. "A fat kitchen wife playing at rancher. Won't last the week." They didn't say it quiet. They never did. And Margaret, hanging wet linen on the line within earshot, let them have their say, and then walked over to the corral fence and folded her arms on the top rail. "Pete, is it?" The young hand swallowed. "Yes'm." "Pete, how many calves did this ranch wean last fall out of? How many cows bred?" Pete looked at the other men. I don't rightly know the count, ma'am." "No," Margaret said. "Nobody here does. That's the whole trouble. You've got a dozen grown men running an operation, and not a single one of you can tell me whether you're making money or losing it, because not one of you ever wrote it down." She let that sit. "Now, I aim to find out. And the man who helps me find out is the man who still has wages come spring, because the ones who don't will be looking for work on a ranch that's gone under. So you tell me, Pete, you want to laugh or you want to keep your job?" Pete was quiet a moment. Then he climbed off the fence. "What is it you need, counted ma'am?" Behind him, the laughing stopped. Not all of it. Cyrus Doyle was a harder case. That evening he came to Nathan alone out by the barn where the woman couldn't hear. "Nathan, you can't let her run cattle decisions. The men won't stand for it. I won't stand for it." She found Tillett's been gouging us, Cyrus. $200 a year easy. You knew Tillett sold high. Why didn't you ever say? Cyrus's face went stiff. "That ain't your daddy always." "My daddy's dead." Nathan's patience was a worn rope, and it was fraying. "And in one day, that woman found money we've been bleeding for years. Money, Cyrus. So before you tell me what she can't do, you tell me why a fat widow from Kansas saw it, and my own foreman didn't." Cyrus had no answer for that. He'd had no answer all day, and it had soured him through. "She'll cost you the respect of every man here," he said finally. "Respect don't pay the bank." Nathan turned away. "Get the herd counted like she asked. Every head. I want the number by tomorrow night." The count took 2 days. When it was done, Margaret laid the tally beside the ledger, and the number was worse than Nathan had feared, and better than he'd let himself believe both at once. He'd been running fewer cattle than he thought, losing more than he'd recorded, and feeding them on ground that couldn't carry them. "Here's the truth of it," Margaret told him, the two of them alone at the table again after dark. "You've got just enough good stock left to climb out of this hole, or to fall the rest of the way in. There's no middle road anymore. You either change how this ranch is run top to bottom, or you sell to the bank in the spring and ride off with what's in your saddlebags." Nathan sat with his hands flat on the table. "Change it how?" she told him. "Rotate the grazing fence the land into sections, move the herd before the grass was gone so it could grow back behind them. Stop selling breeding cows to make payments and stretch the debt instead. Buy hay from the honest man up the creek. Cure the beef in a shed that didn't leak instead of the one that had been spoiling 1/10 of it every winter. Write everything down. Every head, every dollar, every pound of feed. It's a year of hard work," she said. "And it'll get harder before it gets easier. And every man on this place is going to fight me on every piece of it because it's me saying it and not you." "Then I'll say it," Nathan said. She looked up. "You hear me, woman? You figure it. I'll say it. The men won't take it from you, fine. They'll take it from me. But I want it understood between us." He leaned forward. "If I'm going to stake my daddy's ranch on the say-so of a wife I've known a week, then I'm staking it because I believe you. Not because I'm out of other notions. You understand the difference." Margaret was quiet for a moment. In all her years, through all the rejections, through every man who'd looked at her and seen only the shape of her, and never once the mind behind her eyes, no one had ever said a thing like that to her. That he believed her. Not that he'd settle for her. That he believed her. "I understand it," she said, and her voice was not as steady as she would have liked. "Good." Nathan stood. "Then we start tomorrow." They started tomorrow, and the next morning when Cyrus Doyle gathered the hands by the corral and told them they'd be stringing wire to cut the South Range into grazing sections, on the orders of a woman who'd been on the ranch 8 days, a hand spat in the dust and said what half of them were thinking. "I didn't sign on to take orders from no fat kitchen wife." Margaret was there. She'd made it her business to be there. She walked across the yard slow, and she didn't raise her voice. And she stopped in front of the man who'd said it, and she looked up at him because he was taller, and the whole yard went still. "You're right," she said. The man blinked. "You didn't sign on for it, and you don't have to stay for it. There's the gate." She nodded toward it. "But before you walk through it, you ought to know that the men who stay are going to be the men with steady work and full wages come next winter when every other outfit in this valley is selling off cheap and turning hands loose. So you go on and decide which kind of man you want to be. Nobody here's going to stop you either way." The man looked at the gate. He looked at the other hands. He looked at Nathan, who said nothing at all, only stood with his arms crossed, letting her words be the law of the place. The man picked up a roll of wire. "Where you want the first post, ma'am?" he said. And Margaret Hayes, the woman no man in Wyoming had wanted, the wife who'd been sent for to salt beef, walked out to the South Range to show 12 grown men how to save a dying ranch, and not one of them was laughing anymore. What none of them knew, what not even Nathan knew, was that the hardest test was still coming. That before the leaves turned, something would sweep across that valley that would put every word Margaret Hayes had spoken to the cruelest trial a person can face. And the day it came, the whole territory would be watching to see whether the man had been a fool to believe her. Orchestrated dense narrative continuation, void dialogue-driven action, the multiple mini-climaxes. Orchestrated dense narrative continuation, void dialogue-driven action, the multiple mini-climaxes. The first post went in the ground before the sun cleared the ridge, and by the time it did, Margaret Hayes was already arguing with the man holding the second one. "Not there," she said. 40 paces down." "Cyrus marked it here, ma'am." "Cyrus marked it where the ground's hard. I marked it where the gate needs to be. You want to drive the herd through a corner they can't turn in." She pointed down the slope. 40 paces, where the land's soft and the cattle won't bunch." The hand looked to Cyrus. Cyrus looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at nobody, just kept his arms folded and his jaw set, and said the 3 words that settled it. "Do what she says." The post went in 40 paces down. It went on like that the whole first week. Every fence line, a small war fought post by post. Margaret had walked the South Range twice over before she'd let a single nail be struck, and she carried the whole map of it in her head, every dip and rise, every place the grass grew thick, and every place it grew thin. The hands thought she was guessing. She wasn't. She'd counted the bare patches. She'd noted where the cattle had chewed the ground to the roots and where they'd never bothered to graze at all. And from that she'd worked out exactly where to cut the land so each section would carry the herd a fortnight and no longer. "You'll move them here first," she told Nathan, the 2 of them standing at the rail while the men strung wire below. 2 weeks, no more. Then through that gate to the second section. By the time they've grazed the 4th, the 1st'll have come back green. You keep them circling, and the grass never dies, and the land feeds twice the cattle it's feeding now. And if the rain don't come, then the grass comes back slower and you circle slower. But it comes back, Nathan. That's the whole of it. Right now you graze a field to dirt and then pray over it. Praying's fine, but the Lord helps the rancher who moves his cattle. Nathan almost smiled at that. Almost. It was the closest he'd come in months. By the end of the 2nd week, the South Range was fenced into 6 sections, and the first time they moved the herd through the gates the way Margaret had planned it, every hand on the place stood at the rail to watch it fail. It didn't fail. The cattle filed through clean found grass that hadn't been touched in 2 seasons and spread out to graze instead of balling and bunching the way they always had. Pete leaned on the rail beside Cyrus. "Well, I'll be." "Don't," Cyrus said. "I'm just saying it worked, Cyrus." "It worked once. Stringing wire's the easy part. Let's see her keep it working come the dry of August." He spat. "Land's got a way of humbling people who think they've outsmarted it." But the dry of August came, and the grass in the rested sections came up green behind the herd, and the land did not humble Margaret Hayes. It was Cyrus who was humbled, though he'd have ridden to Laramie and back before he'd say so. The grazing was only the start of it. While the men strung wire, Margaret had been at war on a second front, and that one she fought in the curing shed. She'd gone into it her 3rd day on the ranch and come out with a face like a thundercloud. "Nathan, come look at this." He'd followed her in. She'd pointed at the roof where daylight showed through in a dozen places, and at the floor where the beef was laid out on planks gone soft and black with rot. "You're losing 1/10 of every animal you cure," she'd said. "Maybe more. The damp gets in, the salt washes out, the meat spoils, and you throw it to the hogs and call it the way of things. You know what a tenth of your winter beef is worth. He'd known. He'd just never let himself add it up. Fix the roof, she'd said. Raise the racks off the floor. Cure the meat dry and cure it cold, and you'll ship every pound you cut instead of feeding the difference to the pigs. That's a week's work for 2 men. It's a week that pays for itself 10 winters over. She'd put her hand flat on a rotting plank. Nathan, you wrote me here to salt your beef. Well, I'm telling you how to salt it so it don't spoil before it's sold. That's the job. Let me do the job. He'd given her the 2 men. The roof got fixed, the racks got raised, and the first cattle they cured in the dry shed came out clean and firm, and not a pound of it went to the hogs, and even Cyrus, walking through to count it, couldn't find the rot he'd come looking for. Don't mean nothing, he muttered. But it meant something. It meant $140 of beef that hadn't spoiled, and Margaret wrote that number in the ledger in her careful hand and underlined it and showed it to Nathan by lamplight that night. That's 1 shed, she said. 1 roof, 1 week. You see now why I wanted the books before I wanted anything else. Nathan looked at the number a long while. My daddy threw away $140 a winter, he said slowly, for 20 years. Your daddy did the best he knew. So did you. There's no shame in not knowing a thing. The shame's in knowing it and not changing. She closed the book. And you're changing. What she didn't say. What she carried alone in those first weeks was how strange it felt to be needed for her mind in a place that had only ever measured her by her body. She'd come to Wyoming expecting the same arrangement she'd been offered before, a man who needed hands and a back, and a woman willing to be unloved in exchange for a roof. She'd braced for it, and instead she'd found a man who pushed a ledger across the table and said, "Show me," and meant it. It frightened her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she knew how to stand against. This she had no practice with at all. The trouble came to a head over the breeding cows in the last week of August, and it came the way trouble always came on Brooks Ranch with the bank. A rider came up the road on a Tuesday with a letter from the Cattlemen's Bank of Cheyenne, and Nathan read it on the porch, and his face went gray. "What is it?" Margaret said. "Payment. Due 1st of October. $400 or they call the note." He folded the paper with hands that weren't quite steady. "I don't have $400, Margaret. I won't have it till the winter beef ships in December." "How much do you have?" "110. Maybe 120 if I sell the spring hides." She did the arithmetic without a pencil. "Then we're short near 300. We're short the whole ranch." Nathan stood and walked the length of the porch and came back. "There's one way. I sell off cows. I've got 18 head of breeding stock I can drive to the railhead and sell by the end of September. That'd cover it." "No." He stopped. "No," Margaret said again. "You sell those 18 cows and you've sold next spring's calves and the spring after. You'd be doing the same thing your daddy did, the same thing that put him in the ground owing money. Selling the future to buy a month. Nathan, those cows are the only thing that grows this herd back. You sell them, you might as well sell the whole place now and save yourself the winter." "Then what?" His voice cracked, and it was the first time she'd heard it crack. "You tell me what, Margaret. The bank don't take promises. They don't take grazing plans and clean curing sheds. They take $400 on the 1st of October, or they take the ranch. So you tell me how a woman's arithmetic gets me $400 in 5 weeks without selling those cows." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Let me see the note. The whole note, not the letter. The papers your daddy signed." He brought them out. She read them at the table, slow line by line, the way she read everything, and Nathan watched her face and waited, and somewhere in the 3rd page, her finger stopped on a line and stayed there. "Nathan?" "What?" "Did your daddy ever miss a payment before he died?" "Never. Not once in his life." "Why?" "Because there's a clause here." She turned the paper toward him. "It says a borrower in good standing, never in default, may request one extension of a single payment up to 90 days on written application to the bank. Your daddy never missed a payment. That means you've never used it. That means you're still in good standing." She looked up. "You don't need $400 by October, Nathan. You need to write the bank a letter." Nathan stared at the line. He'd held that note for 2 years. He'd read it 100 times by the light of his fear, and he'd never once read it by the light of a clear head, because he'd never had a clear head when he read it. 90 days, he said. That's January. That's after the winter beef ships. She closed the papers. You ship in December, you pay the note in January with money in hand and breeding stock still on the range. You don't sell a single cow, you write a letter. He didn't say anything for a long moment. When he did, his voice was rough. How'd you see that and I didn't? Because you've been afraid of that note for 2 years, and fear makes a man read the worst of every line. I wasn't afraid of it. I just read it. She slid the papers to him. Write the letter tonight. I'll help you with the wording so they can't wriggle out of it. He wrote the letter. The bank granted the extension because the clause was the clause, and old Brooks had never missed a payment. And the rider who carried the answer back up the road 3 weeks later carried with it the first real proof in writing on bank paper that the woman everyone called the fat kitchen wife had just saved Brooks Ranch from going under in October. Cyrus heard about it at the trough. Extension, Pete was saying, and there was open admiration in it, now the kind a young man can't hide. She found it right there in the papers. 90 days. Mr. Brooks don't have to sell a single cow. She read a clause, Cyrus said. Any fool could have read a clause. But none of us did, Cyrus. That's the thing. None of us did, and she'd been here a month. Cyrus turned on him, and there was something raw in his face that the younger man had never seen there before. You think she's a savior, boy. You think a fat widow from Kansas knows cattle better than men who've been horseback since they could walk. She's lucky. That's all she is. Lucky. And luck runs out. You wait. You wait till the luck runs out and see how fast she runs back to wherever she came from. But it wasn't luck, and somewhere underneath his anger, Cyrus knew it wasn't. And that was the thing eating at him. It would have been easier if she'd been a fool. A fool he could have managed. A fool he could have stood beside Nathan and quietly steered around. But she wasn't a fool. She was the smartest person on the ranch, smarter than him, and she'd proved it 3 times over in a single month. And every time she proved it again, she made 20 years of his own work look like the blind. Stumbling it had partly been. He'd loved old Brooks like a brother. He'd carried this ranch on his back when the old man got sick. And now a stranger had walked in off a wagon and seen in a month what he'd missed in 2 decades, and there was no honest place for his pride to stand. So his pride stood where wounded pride always stands. It stood against her. The first thing Margaret had done after the curing shed, and before the breeding cows, was the thing the men hated most, and it had nothing to do with grass or beef. It had to do with waste. She'd walked the whole operation in her first fortnight with that stub of pencil and a tally book, and she'd written down every wasted thing she saw, and there were a great many. Feed left out to rot in the rain. A water trough cracked and leaking half its fill into the mud. 3 good saddles left to dry and crack because the tack room roof leaked, same as the curing shed. Lantern oil burned all night in an empty barn. A whole corner of the hayloft gone to mold because nobody had turned the bales. She didn't shame the men for it. That was the thing Nathan came to understand about her, and slow, because it ran against everything he'd learned about how a ranch was run. She didn't shame them. She fixed the system that let it happen. You're working these men hard, she told Nathan one night. Harder than most outfits work theirs. The trouble's not that they're lazy. The trouble's that half their work runs back out through holes nobody patched. You don't need them to work harder, Nathan. You need them to stop bailing water out of a boat with a hole in the bottom. And how do I do that? You fix the boat, 1 hole at a time. She turned to a page in her tally book. Pete spends an hour every morning hauling water because the trough leaks. Patch the trough, you've given that boy an hour. An hour times 300 days is a man's worth of work pulled out of thin air, and you didn't pay a cent more in wages. Nathan looked at her across the lamplight, and something in his face had changed since the first night, something that had been guarded and had quietly stopped guarding. You think like nobody I ever met, he said. I think like a woman who ran a failing farm for 6 years and watched her husband drink the profits and blame the weather. She said it plain without bitterness the way she said most hard things. I learned to see the holes because the holes were all we had. There wasn't ever any luck to fall back on. Just arithmetic and patching. She closed the book. Folks think being poor teaches you to work hard. It don't. Hard work's easy. Being poor teaches you to stop wasting because every wasted thing is a thing you can't replace. I learned to count because counting was all that stood between us and nothing. Nathan was quiet a moment. Your husband, he said carefully. He didn't see what you could do. My husband saw a woman too big to be ashamed of in public and too useful to let go of in private. There was no self-pity in it, only the flat truth of a thing long settled. He never once asked my opinion on anything that mattered. He'd have laughed at the notion. The first time anybody ever asked me to show them my figuring was you, Nathan, across this table that first morning. You want to know why I work the way I do? It's because you asked. That's the whole of it. You asked. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked away because there was something in his chest he didn't have a name for and wasn't ready to find one. The waste got fixed hole by hole, and the men found themselves with hours they'd never had. And a strange thing happened that none of them expected. The work got easier, not less. Easier. And a man who works hard and sees the work hold instead of running back out through a hole is a man who starts slowly to take pride in it. Even Pete's bunkmates stopped calling her the kitchen wife when she wasn't there to hear. They didn't praise her. Cowboys don't praise. But the laughing stopped, and that was its own kind of praise, all but Cyrus. The thing with Cyrus broke open in September, and it broke open over a bull. There was a bull on Brooks Ranch named Samson, a big red brute that old Brooks had paid a fortune for, and that Cyrus tended like it was the last living piece of the dead man. The bull had gone off its feed. It stood listless in the corner of the corral, head low, flanks hollowing, and Cyrus had been dosing it with every remedy he knew for 3 days, with no result. Margaret watched the bull over the rail one evening and watched it a long time, and then she said, "Cyrus, that bull's got a stone." Cyrus turned slow. "Beg your pardon." "A stone. In the gut or the bladder, the way it's standing. My daddy lost a steer to it on the Kansas place. It quits eating, it stands hunched like that. It strains and nothing comes. You've been dosing it for fever. It hasn't got a fever, it's got a stone, and the dosing's making it worse." The yard had gone quiet again. It always went quiet when Margaret spoke to Cyrus because everyone knew by now that those two were the two ends of a rope pulled tight, and everyone wanted to see which way it would snap. Cyrus's face was a slow burn. "I've doctored cattle 30 years, woman. I knew that bull's daddy. You've been on this place 6 weeks and you're going to tell me what ails an animal you looked at over a fence." "I'm telling you what I see, and I'm telling you what I know." He stepped up to the rail, and his voice was low and shaking. "That bull is the finest piece of stock on this ranch. Old Brooks bought him the year before he died. He's worth more than every other animal in that corral put together, and you'd have me what cut him open on the say-so of a Kansas cook. I'd have you call a vet who knows how to pass a stone before that bull dies standing up." Margaret's voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was what made it land. "You keep dosing him for a fever, he hasn't got Cyrus, and you'll have killed old Brooks' prize bull with your own 2 hands, and you'll have done it because a woman told you the truth and you couldn't stand to hear it from her mouth." It was the cruelest thing she'd said to anyone on that ranch, and she said it because it was true, and because the bull would be dead by morning if she didn't. Cyrus went white, then red. His hand closed on the top rail. "Nathan," he said, not looking away from her. "Nathan, you out here." Nathan was. He'd come up quiet behind them the way he did, and he'd heard the whole of it. "I'm here, Cyrus. You going to let your wife stand in my corral and tell me I'm killing your father's bull?" There it was. The whole question. Not about the bull at all in the end, but about who Nathan would stand beside when the standing was hardest. The man who'd carried his father's ranch for 30 years, or the woman who'd carried it for 6 weeks. Nathan looked at the bull. He looked at Cyrus Gray, and shaking, and proud, and wounded. He looked at Margaret, steady as a fence post, asking nothing, only telling the truth, and letting it stand or fall on its own. "Cyrus," he said. "How long you been dosing that bull for fever?" 3 days. "And is he better or worse?" Cyrus's jaw worked. It takes time, the medicine." "Is he better or worse, Cyrus?" A long silence. "Worse," Cyrus said. "Then we'll send Pete for the vet tonight," Nathan said quietly. "And we'll tell the vet to look for a stone. And if it's a stone, Cyrus, then my wife saved my father's bull, and you'll thank her for it. And if it ain't a stone, then I'll stand here and tell her she was wrong, and she'll take it because she's not a woman who needs to be right. But we send for the vet tonight. That's the end of it." Cyrus stood there a moment longer. Then he turned and walked to the barn for his hat and his horse, and his back was the back of a man who has lost something he can't name and knows he's lost it. The vet came at first light. He passed his hand along the bull's flank, pressed low along the belly, and the bull groaned and shifted, and the vet straightened up and said, "He's got a stone, bad one. Another day, and you'd have lost him." He looked up at the ring of faces at the rail. "Who figured it? Whoever caught it early, you saved this animal. A day later, and there'd have been nothing I could do." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Pete, 20 years old and unable to keep his mouth shut, said, "Mrs. Brooks did, sir. Caught it over the fence 3 days ago." The vet looked at Margaret. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, you've got a better eye for stock than half the cowmen in this territory. Where'd you learn it?" "Kansas," Margaret said. "The hard way." The vet worked on the bull for 2 hours, and the bull lived, and by noon it was up and grazing, and by evening it had its head in the feed trough, like nothing had ever been wrong. And Cyrus Doyle stood at the rail watching old Brooks' prize bull eat the bull he'd have killed by sundown with his own 3 days of wrong doctoring, and something in the old man's shoulders came down. He found Margaret that night at the table with her ledgers. He stood in the doorway a long while before he spoke, turning his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Brooks?" She looked up. "Cyrus?" "That bull." He stopped, started again. "If you hadn't said, if Nathan hadn't sent for the vet, he'd be dead. Old Brooks's bull. I'd have killed him." His voice was thick. 30 years I doctored cattle on this place, and I'd have killed the best animal we got because I couldn't stand to take the truth from a—" He stopped himself. "From a fat woman," Margaret said gently. "You can say it, Cyrus. I've heard it before. From most everyone most of my life." The old man's face twisted. "That ain't a thing I'm proud of. Saying it, thinking it. I know it ain't. I loved that man, old Brooks. Loved him like blood." Cyrus's eyes were wet, and he didn't bother to hide it. "And I've been telling myself I was protecting his ranch, fighting you. Protecting his ways. But his ways was killing this place, wasn't they? Slow, for years. And I helped because I never wanted to see it. And you saw it in a month, and it shamed me, and I've been making you pay for the shame." Margaret set down her pencil. "Cyrus, sit down." He sat. "You loved a man, and you loved his ways because his ways were how you remembered him," she said. "There's no shame in that. The shame would have been holding to it after you knew. And you don't know me well enough yet to know this, so I'll tell you. I don't keep a tally on people. I keep it on hay and cattle and dollars, because those don't have feelings to hurt. People I let start fresh every morning, because the Lord knows I've needed folks to do the same for me, and they almost never did." She looked at him steady. "You want to start fresh, Cyrus, tomorrow morning? Then we start fresh. I could use a man who's been horseback on this land 30 years. There's things you know that I'll never learn out of a book. The grazing, the figuring, the books, that's mine. But the land and the stock and the weather, that's yours. And I've been wishing for a month I had a partner in it instead of a man at the other end of a rope." Cyrus Doyle, who had not wept at old Brooks's funeral because cowboys don't weep, put his weathered hand over his eyes and wept at Margaret's table. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "I know you are. Now dry your face before Pete comes in and tells the bunkhouse the foreman cried. We've got a herd to move at dawn, and I need you to tell me whether the North Creek's gone dry, because if it has, my whole grazing plan for October's wrong, and I'll need you to fix it for me." Cyrus wiped his face and almost laughed. "It's gone half dry. You'd want to swing the herd west of it, not east like you got marked." "See," Margaret said. 6 weeks I'd have got that wrong. Sit. Show me on the map." He sat. He showed her on the map. And from that night forward, Cyrus Doyle, who had been the loudest voice against her, became the surest voice for her. And the rope that had been pulled tight between them was cut clean, and in its place grew something neither of them had words for: the loyalty of a proud man to the person who'd let him keep his pride while taking it down. Nathan watched it happen from the doorway unseen, and he understood then a thing about his wife that he'd half known and not let himself finish thinking. She could have broken Cyrus. She'd had every right and every reason. She could have made him crawl, made him grovel, run him off the ranch, and been within her rights to do it. And instead she'd handed him back his dignity with one hand while she fixed his mistakes with the other, and made an enemy into the most loyal man on the place, and never once raised her voice to do it. He went out to the porch and stood in the dark a long time. He thought about the advertisement he'd placed, the wife to salt beef. He thought about the train fare he'd grudged. He thought about how close he'd come that first day to seeing the laughing men's view of her instead of his own. And a kind of cold went through him at how nearly he'd let the most valuable thing ever to come to Brooks Ranch climb back on a wagon and ride away. The grazing held through September. The rested sections came back green. The breeding cows stayed on the range. The curing shed kept its beef dry, and the winter contract beef began to take shape pound by clean pound in numbers. Margaret wrote down every night in her steady hand. And then, in the first week of October, with the extension granted, and the ranch finally beginning to breathe, the rider came up the road again, and this time, the news he carried turned every face on Brooks Ranch white. He came at a gallop, which no man does on a tired horse for good news. Nathan met him in the yard. The rider didn't even dismount. "Brooks, you heard?" "Heard what?" "Heard. Fever, cattle fever. Bad. It's hit the Carmody place and the Strawn place, both hit 'em hard. Whole herds going down. They're saying it come up from the Texas drives, the tick fever, the kind that don't quit. Carmody lost 40 head in 3 days. Strawn's worse." The rider's horse danced under him. "Every man in the valley's loading cattle for the railhead tonight, Brooks. Sell now before it spreads or lose it all. That's the word. Sell tonight." He wheeled the horse and was gone up the road to carry the same word to the next ranch, and Nathan stood in the yard with the dust settling around him and felt the bottom drop out of everything he'd let himself begin to hope. The hands came out of the barn. Cyrus came from the corral. Margaret came from the house drying her hands, and she read the whole of it in Nathan's face before he said a word. "Fever," he said. "Carmody and Strawn. Whole valley's selling tonight." For a moment nobody spoke. The word fever on a cattle ranch is the word fire in a dry season. It was the thing that had killed 40 head the spring before. It was the thing that had started the whole slow fall of Brooks Ranch in the first place. And now, it was back in the valley, 3 ranches off, and the whole territory was already running for the railhead. "We load tonight," Cyrus said, and it was the old fear talking, the fear 30 years deep. "We load every head we got, and we drive 'em to the railhead by morning, and we sell while there's still a buyer. Margaret, I'm sorry, I know the breeding stock, I know the plan, but you can't plan against fever. You sell or you bury. That's the only 2 roads there's ever been." "No," Margaret said. Cyrus stopped. So did every man in the yard, because she'd said it the same way she'd said it about the breeding cows, quiet and flat and final, and they'd all learned by now what that no meant. "You can't fight fever, Mrs. Brooks." But Cyrus said it gentle now, almost pleading a man who'd come to trust her, begging her to be wrong this once for her own sake. "I've seen it. It comes through a herd like the angel of death. You can't fence it out, you can't doctor it. All you can do is get your animals to market before they fall." "That's how it spreads," Margaret said. "What?" "That's how it spreads, Cyrus. Think on it. Why's it jumping ranch to ranch so fast? It's not the wind. Fever don't ride the wind." She turned to face all of them, and her voice for once did rise, not in anger, but in the urgency of someone who's seen a thing the others haven't. "It's the selling. Every rancher in this valley is driving sick and healthy cattle together to the same railhead, into the same pens, past the same buyers. They're mixing it. They're spreading it themselves, every one of them trying to outrun it. The fever's not chasing the herds. The herds are carrying it to each other at a gallop all the way to Cheyenne. Nathan stared at her. How do you know that? Because I watched it on the Kansas plains when I was a girl. Same fever, same panic, same men loading sick stock onto the same trains as the healthy, and the fever following the rails all the way down the line, ranch to ranch to ranch, because the men hauling it thought they were hauling themselves to safety. She turned back to Cyrus. The ranches that lost everything weren't the ones that stood still. They were the ones that ran. And the few that came through with a herd were the ones who shut their gates, kept their cattle home, and didn't let a sick animal near a well one for a single hour. The yard was dead silent. You're saying, Nathan said slowly, that we don't sell. I'm saying we don't sell one head. With fever, 3 ranches off. With fever, 3 ranches off. She held his eyes. I'm saying we shut the gates. We don't drive anywhere. We pull every animal off the shared range near the Carmody line, and we move them deep into our own sections, the ones we rested, the clean ones. We post a man on every fence so not one stray crosses onto our grass, and not one of ours wanders off. We watch every head morning and night, and the first animal that shows sick, we cut it from the herd that hour, that minute, and we keep it apart till we know. We don't mix the sick with the well. Not ever. That's the whole of it, Nathan. The men running to the railhead tonight are the ones who'll lose everything. The man who shuts his gate and watches his herd is the man who'll have cattle come spring. And if you're wrong... Cyrus's voice cracked. If the fever's in our herd already and we don't sell, we don't get a dime, and we bury the whole outfit instead of selling it for half. You'd have us bet the entire ranch, every head, every dollar on you being right about a sickness you saw as a girl in Kansas. It was the same question as the bull, only the stakes weren't one animal now. The stakes were everything. The whole ranch, every man's wages, Nathan's father's land. All of it on the say-so of the woman they'd called the kitchen wife. Nathan looked down the road where the rider had gone. He could hear it faint on the evening air, the bawling of cattle being driven hard somewhere off to the south, the Carmody herd or the Strawn men running their stock through the dark toward Cheyenne. The whole valley was running. Every cowman he'd ever known, every neighbor, every voice that had ever told him how a ranch was run. All of them were loading cattle this very hour to outrace the fever to market. And his wife was telling him to shut the gate and stand still. Nathan. Margaret's voice was quiet now. The whole weight of it was in how quiet it was. I have been wrong about small things on this ranch, and you've watched me be wrong and watched me say so. The hay grade, the North Creek. I'll be wrong about a dozen more things before I'm done, because I'm learning this country same as anyone. But I am not wrong about this. I watched it kill the men who ran and spare the men who stood still. I watched it as a girl, and I never forgot it, because it was the worst thing I ever saw, men driving dying cattle through the night, spreading their own ruin, and not one of them able to stop because the fear had them by the throat. She stepped closer. The fear's got this whole valley by the throat tonight. It's reaching for yours. Don't let it have you. Shut the gate. Nathan stood there a long moment, and the bawling of the distant herd came thin across the dark, and every man in the yard waited to see whether he'd run with the valley or stand with his wife. He turned to Cyrus. Cyrus, how many men do we need to post the fences? Every one. The whole boundary. Cyrus stared at him. Nathan, how many? The old foreman looked at Margaret. He looked at the dark road. He looked back at the man whose father he'd loved, and whatever war had been in him these 6 weeks, it was over, and Margaret had won it the night she let him keep his pride over the bull. 8, Cyrus said. 8 men in pairs, 2-hour watches. We can shut this whole boundary tight by midnight. Then do it. Nathan's voice was steel now. The fear burned out of it, and something harder left behind. Shut the gates. Pull the herd into the rested sections. Post the fences. Nobody sells one head. Nobody drives 1 mile. We stand still. He looked at the men, every one of them. If she's right, we'll be the only outfit in this valley with a herd come spring. If she's wrong, we'll lose it standing on our own ground instead of running like rabbits to Cheyenne. And I'd rather lose it that way. He turned. But she's not wrong. I've watched this woman for 6 weeks. She's not wrong. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Cyrus Doyle put 2 fingers to his hat brim, turned to the hands, and started barking orders. And the yard came alive, men running for the horses, for the fence lines, for the gates, and the whole of Brooks Ranch turned on a single word from a single woman and chose to stand still while the entire territory ran. Margaret watched them scatter to the fences. Her hands, she found, were shaking. She'd kept them still through the whole of it, through every eye fixed on her, through Cyrus's cracking voice and Nathan's long silence, and now in the dark with no one watching, they shook. Nathan came to stand beside her. "You sure?" he said. Not a challenge. Just a man and his wife alone for a moment in the running dark. "No," she said. "I'm not sure. I'm right, but I'm not sure. Those aren't the same thing, and anybody who tells you different is selling something." She looked up at him. "I've never bet a whole ranch on what I know before. Just my own poor neck. It's a different weight." "Then why'd you tell me to do it?" "Because being unsure isn't the same as being wrong. Because I'd rather be right and frightened than safe and ruined. And because—" She stopped. "Because what?" "Because you asked me," she said. "Same as that first morning. You stood there in front of every man you've got with the whole valley running the other way, and you asked me what to do, and then you did it. Do you know how many men in my whole life have asked me what to do and then done it, Nathan? 1. You. And I'll not let the one man who ever trusted my mind lose his ranch for trusting it. So I'll be right. I'll make myself be right. I'll watch that herd day and night till the fever passes us by, because you trusted me, and I'd sooner die than let that trust be the thing that ruined you." Nathan looked at her in the dark for a long moment. "Margaret," he said, "when I placed that advertisement, I wrote that I wanted a wife to salt the beef. I remember. I was a fool." "You were a desperate man," she said. "There's a difference, and you've earned the kinder word. No." He shook his head. "Let me say it. I wrote that I wanted a wife to salt beef. And what walked through my gate—" He stopped and started again rougher. "What walked through my gate was worth more than my whole herd and all my father's land and every dollar that bank ever lent us, and I damn near didn't see it because I was looking at the wrong thing, same as every fool who ever laughed at you. And I want you to know I see it now. Whatever happens with this fever, whether you're right or you're wrong, I see it now." Margaret Hayes, who had heard cruel words from men her whole life, and kind words, almost never stood in the dark and could not for the life of her find a single word to say back. So she didn't say one. She put her shaking hand on his arm just for a moment, and he put his rough hand over it just for a moment, and out in the dark, the gates of Brooks Ranch swung shut one by one, and the men took up their stations along the fences, and somewhere off to the south, the last of the Carmody herd bawled its way toward Cheyenne and the ruin that was waiting there. Through that first night, Margaret did not sleep. She walked the fence lines with a lantern from post to post, checking each pair of watchmen, and she stopped at the herd in the rested sections again and again, walking among the cattle in the dark, laying her hand on flank after flank, feeling for the heat of fever, watching for the hollow flank, and the low head, and the dull eye. The men watched her do it. A heavy woman in a dark dress, lantern in hand, moving among 600 head of cattle at 2 in the morning, and not a man among them thought of laughing now. They thought of their wages and their winter, and the fact that this woman, who could have been asleep in a warm bed, was out here with them watching the same herd, betting the same bet, awake and afraid, and unwilling to leave it to anyone else. Mrs. Brooks. Pete fell in beside her on the south fence near dawn. "You ought to rest, ma'am. You've been up all night, same as us." "So have you, Pete. I'm 20. You're—" He caught himself. Margaret laughed soft, the first laugh in hours. "I'm older than 20 and heavier than a fence post, and I'll thank you to finish that sentence one of these days when you're feeling brave." Pete went red. "I didn't mean. I know what you meant. You meant be kind to yourself, ma'am, and it's a kind thing to mean, and I'll rest when this herd's clear, not before." She lifted the lantern and looked out over the dark range. "You scared Pete?" "Yes'm, some." "Good. So am I. A person's not a fool for being scared. A person's only a fool for letting the fear drive the wagon." She lowered the lantern. "Now, go on and check the east gate for me, and if you see one animal standing off by itself, one head that won't come to feed you, come find me that minute, day or night. You understand?" "That's the whole game now, Pete. We win it one sick animal at a time by catching them before they touch the others." "Yes, ma'am." And the boy went at a run, proud to be trusted with it. The first sick animal showed on the third day. A young steer off its feed, standing apart, head low, exactly as she'd told them to watch for. Pete found it at dawn and came at a dead run for the house, and Margaret was out the door before he'd finished his sentence. She looked at the steer a long moment, the way she'd looked at the bull. "That's it," she said quietly. "That's the fever. It got in." The men's faces went gray. If it had got in, then maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe shutting the gates had doomed them. Maybe even now, the sickness was moving through 600 head, and they'd lose the whole herd standing on their own ground. "Cut it out," Margaret said. "Now, this minute. Move it to the far pen, the one by the north line, away from every other animal. 2 men, and those 2 men don't go near the main herd again today. Not the feed, not the water, nothing. Burn the bedding where it stood. Pete, you watched it, you tell me. Did it drink from the main trough this morning?" "No, ma'am, it wouldn't drink. That's how I saw it. The others all crowded the trough and it just stood off. Then it didn't share the water." She let out a breath. "That's our luck, and your good eye, Pete. We caught it before it drank with the others. Cut it out, isolate it, and we watch. If we got it in time, it's one animal. If we didn't, we'll know in 2 days." She looked at the ring of frightened men. "This is the whole of it, what I told you. Not one outfit in this valley is doing this. They're all at the railhead mixing sick and well. We're the only ones cutting the sick ones out the hour they show. So we hold, we watch, we cut, one animal at a time." They cut the steer out. They isolated it. They watched. And for 2 days the whole of Brooks Ranch held its breath, every man walking the herd morning and night with his hand out for the heat of fever, every eye searching for the low head and the hollow flank, and Margaret Hayes walking among them, with her lantern and her steady voice, never sleeping more than 2 hours, never letting the fear drive the wagon, while 3 ranches off the herds that had run were dying in the railhead pens of Cheyenne by the hundred. On the morning of the 3rd day, after they cut out the steer, Cyrus Doyle came to find Margaret where she'd finally fallen asleep at the table with her head on the open ledger. He stood in the doorway, and he didn't want to wake her because she'd earned the sleep 10 times over, but he woke her anyway, gentle, his hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Brooks, Margaret." She came awake all at once. "What? Is it another one? How many?" "None," Cyrus said, and his weathered face was working, and his eyes were wet for the 2nd time in a month. "None, Margaret. 3 days. We walked the whole herd this morning, every head twice. Not one more sick animal. Not one. The steer in the far pen's the only one, and it's still standing, might even pull through. 3 days, and not one more." His voice broke. "It worked. It's working. We cut out the one, and it didn't touch the rest. You held the line. 600 head, and we held the line." Margaret sat very still for a moment. Then she put both hands over her face, and her shoulders shook, and Cyrus Doyle, who'd called her a fat kitchen wife 6 weeks before, put his old hand on her shaking shoulder and let her weep at the table the way she'd let him weep at it. And neither of them said a word, because there weren't any words for it, for the weight she'd carried and the bet she'd won, and the herd that stood alive on the rested grass while the whole valley buried its dead. Nathan found them like that. He stood in the doorway, and he understood all of it without a word, and he came and stood behind his wife's chair and put his hand on her other shoulder, and the 3 of them stayed that way a long moment in the gray morning light. The man and the foreman and the heavy woman from Kansas, who had just done the thing every cowman in the territory had sworn could not be done. She'd stood still. While the whole world ran, she'd stood still and held 600 head of cattle alive on her own clear-eyed nerve. And out beyond the shut gates of Brooks Ranch, across a valley going quiet with ruin, the fever burned itself out among the herds that had run, and the men who had laughed at Margaret Hayes began one ranch at a time to count what was left to them, and to hear on the wind that there was one outfit in the whole valley that hadn't lost its herd, and to wonder how in God's name a dying ranch with a fat kitchen wife had been the only one left standing. The wondering didn't stay wondering for long. By the second week after the fever burned out, the wondering had soured into something else, and it rode up the Brooks Ranch road on a fine bay horse, wearing a town suit and a banker's smile. His name was Harlan Crabb, and he owned the Cattlemen's Bank of Cheyenne, the same bank that held Nathan's note, and he came up the road alone on a Thursday morning with a leather satchel across his saddle, and that smile already fixed on his face before he was close enough for anyone to see it. Margaret saw him first. She was at the curing shed checking the racks, and she came out wiping her hands and watched him ride in, and something in the set of the man put her on her guard before he'd said a single word. She'd seen that kind of smile before. It was the smile of a man come to take something while pretending to give. "Cyrus," she said quietly when the foreman came up beside her. "Who is that?" "That," Cyrus said, and he spat, "is Harlan Crabb, owns the bank, owns half the paper in this valley. And if he's riding up here personal with a satchel, then somebody's about to lose something because that man don't leave his office for less." Nathan came out of the barn, and his face when he saw the rider was the face of a man watching weather come in. "Mr. Crabb," he said. "Nathan Brooks." Crabb swung down easy and put out a soft hand. "And this would be the famous Mrs. Brooks. Why, the whole territory's talking about you, ma'am. The woman who saved a herd while better men lost theirs." He smiled wider. "I had to come see it for myself." "You came a long way to see cattle, Mr. Crabb," Margaret said. "I came to talk business, ma'am. Might we sit?" They sat. On the porch with coffee, Margaret poured but did not drink, and Crabb opened his satchel and laid out his papers, and his smile never moved the whole time. And Margaret watched it the way a person watches a snake that hasn't yet decided to strike. "I'll be plain," Crabb said, which Margaret had learned was the thing men said right before they were anything but. "You folks have had a run of luck, genuine luck. The fever spared your herd. And now, well, now you're sitting on the only healthy cattle in the whole valley, and come spring, when every other outfit's trying to rebuild from nothing, your beef's going to be worth a fortune. A genuine fortune." He tapped the papers. "Which is why I've come with an offer. A generous one. I'd like to buy Brooks Ranch, lock, stock, and herd. Pay off your note, put cash money in your pocket, and let you walk away from all this worry, a wealthy man." Nathan went still. "The ranch ain't for sale, Mr. Crabb. Now hear me out. You're a young man. You've fought hard. But ranching's a hard road, and it'll break your back before it's done, and here's a chance to take a profit and rest." He slid a paper across the table. "That figure there. That's what I'm offering. More than this place has ever been worth. More than your father ever dreamed it'd fetch." Nathan looked at the figure. Margaret watched his face. She saw the number register, saw the size of it, saw the temptation move through him, the way temptation moves through any tired man who's been afraid of a bank for 2 years and is suddenly offered the chance to never be afraid of it again. "That's a lot of money," Nathan said slowly. "It's a fortune," Crabb said. "Nathan." Margaret's voice was very quiet. "Don't sign anything." Crabb's smile flicked toward her. "Mrs. Brooks, with respect, this is a matter for the both of us," she said. "It's both our names that'll be on whatever you're asking him to sign, Mr. Crabb, so it's both of us you'll be talking to. Now, may I see that paper?" Crabb's smile thinned just for an instant, and in that instant, Margaret saw everything she needed to know about him. He hadn't expected her to ask. He'd come up the road counting on a tired, frightened man and a fat kitchen wife who'd be flattered to be at the table at all, and he'd laid his trap for that man. And now the wife was holding out her hand for the paper, and his smile had a crack in it. He gave her the paper. He couldn't very well not. Margaret read it the way she read everything, slow, line by line. And the porch went quiet, and Nathan watched her face, and Crabb watched her face, and somewhere in the second page, her finger stopped and stayed. "Mr. Crabb," she said. What's this herd worth come spring, your honest figure? Healthy cattle the only ones in the valley with every other ranch needing to restock. Hard to say, ma'am. Markets? Your honest figure. Crab's smile was gone now. 3 times what I've offered. Maybe 4. But that's spring, Mrs. Brooks. That's if you survive the winter. That's if nothing else goes wrong, and a great many things can go wrong. 3 to 4 times. Margaret set the paper down. You've come up here to buy a ranch for a quarter of what you know it'll be worth in 6 months, and you've dressed it up as a kindness so a tired man would take it before he did the arithmetic. She looked at him steady. That's not an offer, Mr. Crab. That's a robbery with a smile on it. The porch was dead silent. Crab's face had gone through several colors and settled on a cold, flat white. The smile did not come back. And when he spoke, the friendliness had drained clean out of his voice, and what was left underneath was the thing that had been there all along. You've got a sharp tongue, Mrs. Brooks, for a woman in your position. And what position is that? A precarious one. Crab began slowly to gather his papers. You think you've won something, the two of you. You think one lucky season makes you cattle barons. But I hold the paper on this ranch, Mrs. Brooks. I hold your note. And notes well. He smiled again, but it was a different smile now, and there was nothing soft in it. Notes have terms. Terms have dates. And a great many things can go wrong between now and January when that payment comes due. He stood. I'd think hard, the both of you, about whether you'd rather walk away wealthy now or risk losing everything over pride. Pride's a poor thing to freeze to death holding. He mounted his fine bay horse, and he rode back down the road, and the threat hung in the air behind him long after the dust had settled. Nobody spoke for a moment. He'll do something, Cyrus said finally low. I know that man. 30 years I've watched him take ranches off folks one bad season at a time. He don't make threats he can't keep, Margaret. If he says a great many things can go wrong, then he's already thinking of the things he'll make go wrong. I know it, Margaret said. She was still looking down the empty road. That number he offered, Nathan said quietly. It was real money, Margaret. It would have paid the note and left us set. And you're sure I shouldn't have. You'd have sold a $4 herd for $1 to a man who'd have laughed about it over his supper, Margaret said. No, you shouldn't have. But Cyrus is right. We've made an enemy, and he's a patient one, and he holds our note. So we'd best stop being surprised by him and start being ahead of him. She turned to Nathan. I want to see every paper your father ever signed with that bank. Every note, every deed, every survey. Tonight, all of it. Why? Because a man like Crab doesn't take a ranch by force. He takes it with paper. And if he's going to come at us with paper, then I want to know what paper we've got before he shows me his. She started for the house. Where does your father keep the deeds? The deeds and the notes and the old survey were in a tin box in the bottom of Nathan's father's trunk, and Margaret spread them all out on the long table that night, and went through them by lamplight one by one the way she'd gone through the ledgers her first night on the ranch. Nathan sat across from her. Cyrus sat at the end. And for 2 hours she read, and the lamp burned down, and the two men watched her and waited, because they'd both learned by now that when Margaret Hayes read papers this slow, she was hunting something, and she usually found it. She found it near midnight. She'd been reading the original deed, the grant that had given old Brooks the land in the first place, comparing it line by line against the survey, and her finger stopped and her whole body went still, and she read the line again and a third time, and then she sat back. Nathan. What? Your water. The creek. The one that runs through the north sections, the one the whole herd drinks from. She turned the deed toward him. Whose land is the head of it on? Where does that creek come from before it reaches your ground? Nathan frowned. The head of the creek's up on the old Pruitt place. Pruitt died 2 years back. No kin the land went. He stopped. The land went where Nathan? To the bank, Cyrus said slowly. Pruitt owed the bank. When he died, the bank took the place. Crab's bank. Crab owns the head of that creek. Margaret nodded slow. And here's the thing. Your father never knew and never told you, she said, and she put her finger on the deed. Your father's grant gives him the land. It gives him the grazing. But it never once mentions the water rights to that creek. Not once. In this whole territory, water and land aren't the same thing in law. A man can own the ground a creek runs through and still not own the right to the water. And your father, God rest him, owned the ground. But the water right to that creek, the legal right to its flow, was filed separate years back, and it's never been in this family's name at all. The two men stared at her. "You're saying," Nathan said, and his voice had gone hoarse, "that Crab owns the water my whole herd drinks." "I'm saying he owns the head of the creek, and the water right was never properly yours, and a man like Harlan Crab has surely already figured both of those things out." Margaret set the deed down. That's what he meant. A great many things can go wrong. He's going to dam that creek, or divert it, or fence the head of it, and dry up your water, and then he won't have to buy your ranch at all. He'll just wait for your cattle to go thirsty and buy the carcasses for nothing. The silence in the room was the silence of three people watching a trap close. "When?" Cyrus said. "When would he do it?" "Before January," Margaret said. "Before the note comes due. He'll dry the creek, watch the herd weaken, and when we can't make the payment because we can't sell weak cattle, he'll call the note and take the ranch and the healthy herd and the water all at once. He doesn't need to make us a bad offer anymore. We turned that down. Now, he just makes the ranch worthless and takes it for the price of the note." She looked at them both. "That's the play. I'd bet my life on it. And it's a good play, and it's a legal play, and that's what makes it so dangerous. He won't break a single law doing it." Nathan stood up so fast his chair went over backward. "Then I'll ride up to that creek and You'll what, Nathan?" Margaret's voice stopped him cold. "Tear down a dam on land you don't own. Threaten a man who's done nothing yet but smile at you. That's exactly what he wants. He wants you angry. He wants you doing something rash on his property so he can bring the law down on you and have you in a cell while your herd dies. The one thing we cannot do, the one thing that loses us everything, is fight him the way he wants to be fought." She set the chair upright. "Sit down. We don't fight Harlan Crab with our fists or our tempers. We fight him with paper, same as he fights us. And to do that, I need to know more than I know now. I need to know who really holds that water right. Because if it's not Crab, then Crab's got a weakness. And a weakness is all I've ever needed." Nathan sat, but his hands were shaking on the table, and Margaret reached across and put her hand over them, the way he'd once put his hand over hers in the dark. "We're not beaten," she said quietly. "We're a long way from beaten. A man like Crab's whole strength is that nobody ever reads the papers as careful as he does. Well, I read papers careful, Nathan. It's the one thing in this world I've always done better than anyone gave me credit for. So we're going to outread him. We're going to find the crack in his paper before he finds the crack in ours. And then we're going to walk through it." She squeezed his hands. "But it starts with the water right. Who holds it? I have to know that before I know anything." The next morning, Margaret did a thing that no one on Brooks Ranch had ever seen a ranch wife do. She had Pete hitch the wagon, and she put on her good traveling dress, and she rode the half-day into the county seat at Cheyenne alone, with the tin box of deeds beside her on the seat, to do the one thing Harlan Crab had never once imagined she would do. She went to the county land office to read the public record. The clerk at the land office was a thin, dusty man named Albert Finch, who had spent his whole life among papers nobody else wanted to read. And when a heavy woman in a good dress walked in and asked in plain, clear words to see the original water rights filings for the creek that headed on the old Pruitt place, he looked at her over his spectacles like she was the first interesting thing to happen to him in a decade. "The Pruitt Creek," he said. "Now that's a curious one, ma'am. What's your interest? My husband's herd drinks from it, and I've reason to think the water right was filed separate from the land years back and never sorted out proper when Pruitt died." Finch's eyebrows went up. "You read deeds, ma'am?" "I read everything, Mr. Finch. It's a habit my late husband found tiresome, and my new husband finds useful." That made the old clerk smile, and a clerk who smiles is a clerk who helps, and Albert Finch climbed his ladder and came down with a great dusty ledger and laid it open on the counter. And the two of them bent over it together, the dusty clerk and the heavy woman, and they read. What they found took Margaret's breath away. The water right to the Pruitt Creek had indeed been filed separate from the land, just as she'd feared. But it had not been filed to Pruitt, and it had not, when Pruitt died, passed to the bank with the land, because the bank had only foreclosed on the land, and the water right was a separate filing, on a separate page, in a separate book, and in the rush of a foreclosure on a dead man with no kin, nobody at Crab's Bank had ever thought to look for it. They'd taken the land. They'd never taken the water, because they'd never known the water was filed apart. And the name on the water right, the legal holder of the right to that creek's flow, filed 30 years before, and never once transferred, was a name Margaret knew. Brooks, she read aloud, and her finger trembled on the page. Elias Brooks. Kin of yours, Finch said. My husband's grandfather. Margaret looked up, and her eyes were wide. Mr. Finch, are you telling me that the right to the water in that creek has belonged to the Brooks family this whole time? That old Elias Brooks filed it 30 years ago, and it passed down, and nobody, not the bank, not anybody ever knew, because the land and the water went separate ways in the record. Finch ran his dusty finger down the page. He checked the dates. He checked the transfers, of which there were none. He checked the page against the index and the index against the book. Ma'am, he said slowly, near as I can read it, and I've read these books 40 years, that water right has belonged to the Brooks family since before your husband was born, and it's never once left it. Pruitt owned the land it sprang from, but Pruitt never owned a drop of the water. He just used it, and nobody ever called him on it because nobody ever read this page. He looked up at her. Your husband owns the water in that creek, Mrs. Brooks, clear as day. He's owned it all along and never knew. For a moment Margaret could not speak. Harlan Crab had ridden up the road planning to dam a creek he thought was his, to dry up a herd he thought was helpless, to take a ranch from a man he thought was a fool, and a woman he thought was a kitchen ornament. And the whole of his plan rested on the water right. And the water right had belonged to the Brooks family the entire time. He didn't own the water. He'd never owned the water. He owned the head of the creek, the dirt it sprang from, and not one legal drop of what flowed through it. If Crab dammed that creek, he wouldn't be drying up his own trespassers. He'd be stealing water that belonged in law to Nathan Brooks. And that was a thing the courts would not abide, because water in the dry country was the difference between life and death, and the territorial courts guarded water rights like gold. Mr. Finch, Margaret said, and her voice was unsteady. I need certified copies of the water right, of every transfer, or rather every page showing there were no transfers, of the whole record, certified with your seal so no man can say they're forged. Today. Now. I'll pay whatever the fee is. That I can do, ma'am. Finch was already reaching for his pen and his seal, and there was a light in the old man's eye, the light of a keeper of dull records who has just discovered he holds the one record that matters. And might I say, whoever was planning to dry up your husband's water, they're in for a considerable surprise. They are, Mr. Finch, Margaret said. They surely are. She rode home that evening with the certified copies wrapped in oilcloth and held against her chest the whole half-day's ride like something that might fly away. And when she came up the Brooks Ranch road in the last light, Nathan was waiting at the gate because he'd been at the gate for 2 hours, unable to sit, unable to eat, and he saw her face before she'd even stopped the wagon. You found something, he said. Help me down. He helped her down. She held the oilcloth packet against her chest. Nathan. She could barely get the words out. The water in that creek. The creek your whole herd drinks from. The creek Crab means to dam. She put the packet in his hands. It's yours. It's always been yours. Your grandfather Elias filed the right to it 30 years ago, and it passed down through your family, and it never once left, and the bank took Pruitt's land, but they never took the water because they never knew the water was filed apart. Crab doesn't own a drop of it. You do. You've owned it your whole life and never known. Nathan stared at the packet in his hands. He opened it with shaking fingers, and there were the certified copies, sealed with Albert Finch's seal, the words plain and legal and undeniable. Elias Brooks. Water right. Never transferred. My grandfather, he whispered. Filed it 30 years ago and likely forgot he'd ever done it, and your father never knew, and you never knew, and Harlan Crabb, sure as sin, never knew. Margaret's voice cracked. If he dams that creek, Nathan, he's not protecting his property. He's stealing yours. And we've got the papers to prove it, certified, sealed, that no judge in the territory can wave away. He thought he held the knife. He doesn't. We do. We've held it the whole time and never knew we were holding it. Cyrus had come up behind them, and Pete behind him, and the other hands gathering in the dusk, drawn by the look on Nathan's face, and Margaret turned and told them all plain what she'd found. And a sound went through the men that started as a murmur and rose to something like a cheer, because every one of them had spent 2 weeks expecting to watch the ranch they'd just saved be taken anyway by a banker with a smile. And now the heavy woman from Kansas had ridden alone into Cheyenne and come back with the one paper that turned the whole thing upside down. But Margaret raised her hand and the cheer died because her face was not the face of a woman who'd won. Don't celebrate yet, she said. We've got the knife. But a knife in the hand's no use if you don't know how to use it. Harlan Crabb is a clever, patient, ruthless man, and he holds our note, and he's got money and lawyers and the bank behind him, and we've got one old water right and the truth. That's enough. But only if we play it exactly right. If we go to him now and wave these papers, he'll find a way around them. He'll forge something. He'll buy a judge. He'll tie us up in court till the herd dies anyway. The one thing we cannot do is show him our hand before we've got him where the truth can't be wriggled out of. Then what do? Nathan said. We wait, Margaret said. We let him make his move. We let him dam that creek in front of witnesses in writing on the record, thinking he's clever, thinking we're helpless. We let him commit the crime all the way, so there's no taking it back. And then when he's done it, when he's dried our water and called our note and stood there smiling, certain he's won. Her voice went very quiet. Then we show him whose water he stole, and we don't show it to him. We show it to a federal judge. The men were silent. You'd let him dam the creek, Cyrus said. Let the herd go thirsty. That's a terrible risk, Margaret. Cattle can't go but so long without water. Not the whole herd, not for long. Margaret's mind was already moving 3 steps down the road. We've got the old North, well, the one that's gone half to disuse. We clean it out. We deepen it quiet starting tomorrow, so we've got water of our own if the creek goes dry. Enough to keep the herd alive a few weeks. Crabb won't know about the well. He'll dam the creek and sit back and wait for us to come crawling, and we won't come because we'll have water he doesn't know about, and every day the herd stays alive on water. He can't see as a day his whole plan curdles in the sun. She looked at Nathan. We let him think he's winning right up until the moment the federal marshal puts a hand on his shoulder. That's how you beat a man like Crabb. Not by being stronger. By letting his own cleverness walk him off a cliff. Nathan looked at his wife in the last of the light, and something moved across his face that was past admiration, now past gratitude. Something he'd been circling for weeks, and had finally in that moment stopped circling. Margaret Hayes, he said. Brooks, Margaret Brooks. He shook his head slow. There's not another mind like yours in this whole territory, maybe in the whole country. There's plenty like it, Margaret said. There's just not plenty that ever got asked to use it. She wrapped the papers back in the oilcloth. Now, tomorrow quiet we start on that well, and we say nothing to anyone off this ranch. Not one word about the water right. Crabb has to believe we don't know. The whole thing hangs on him believing we're helpless. So we're going to be helpless, every one of us, every time anyone's watching. We're going to look beaten. We're going to look scared. We're going to let that man feel like the cleverest fellow in Wyoming right up until the day he isn't. And they began the well. The next morning, quiet 2 men at a time, so as not to draw notice, deepening the old north shaft, while above them the autumn turned toward winter. And Harlan Crabb, down in Cheyenne, made his own preparations, certain in his smiling way that the dying ranch with the fat kitchen wife would be his by January. The dam went up in the second week of November. Crab didn't even hide it. He had no reason to. He brought a crew up onto the old Pruitt land onto ground he legally owned, and they threw a dam across the head of the creek in 3 days, timber and earth and stone, and the water backed up into a pond on Crab's side and stopped flowing down onto Brooks' land. And by the end of the week, the creek through the north sections was a dry bed of cracked mud and stranded stones. Nathan rode the dry creek bed with his jaw clenched so hard, Cyrus thought he'd crack a tooth. "Easy," Cyrus said. "Easy, son. This is the part where we play helpless. Remember." "I know what we're playing." Nathan stared up at the dam at the men still working on it at the smoke from their cook fire. "Don't make it easier to watch." The herd moved to the dry north sections, found no water in the creek, and the bawling started, the low, miserable bawling of thirsty cattle. And it was the hardest sound any of them had to bear, because every man on Brooks Ranch knew there was water, knew where it was, knew it was theirs in law, and had to stand and play helpless and listen to the herd cry. But Margaret had been ready. The night the creek ran dry, they moved the herd back south to the rested sections nearest the old north well, and the well deepened and cleaned gave water not much. Not easy, a hard pull on the rope and a slow fill of the troughs, but enough. Enough to keep 600 head alive. The men worked the well in shifts around the clock, hauling water by hand, their shoulders raw with it, and the herd drank and lived, and Harlan Crab, riding past the Brooks boundary the next week to gloat, saw cattle that should have been dying of thirst standing fat and watered on the South Range, and could not for the life of him understand how. He sent a man to find out. Margaret saw the man coming, a rider lingering at the fence line, and she gathered the hands and told them. And when the rider got close enough to ask his careless questions, every man on Brooks Ranch told him the same sorry story. Times were hard. The creek had gone dry, some trouble upstream, and the herd was suffering. And Mr. Brooks was beside himself, and they didn't know how they'd make it to spring. They played it perfectly. They looked beaten. They looked scared. And the rider carried that story back to Crab, and Crab smiled his smile and settled in to wait for the ranch to fall into his hand like fruit off a dying tree. What Crab didn't know was that while he waited, Margaret was writing letters. She wrote them at night in her careful hand, and she had Pete carry them to Cheyenne and post them in secret, and they did not go to Crab or to any judge Crab could buy. They went past Crab, past the county, past the whole local web of men who owed the bank favors. One went to the Territorial Water Commissioner with a certified copy of the Brooks water right and a plain account of the dam Crab had built across a creek whose water belonged in law to Nathan Brooks. And one went further still to the office of the United States Marshal for the territory, because diverting water that belonged to another man in the dry country was not just a county matter. It was a federal one. And federal men did not owe Harlan Crab a thing. "How long?" Nathan asked her the night the last letter went out. "Weeks. A month maybe. The marshal's office moves slow and the commissioner slower, and they'll want to verify the right before they act, which means they'll write to Albert Finch, and Finch will confirm its seal and all." Margaret set down her pen. "It's a long game, Nathan. Crab's note comes due in January. The marshal might not move till December. It's going to be close. It's going to feel right up to the end like we're losing, because Crab's going to keep on winning right up until the moment he loses everything at once." She looked at him. "Can you stand it, watching him strut, watching the herd suffer, playing beaten for weeks when you know the whole time you hold the winning hand?" Nathan was quiet a long moment. "I can stand anything," he said, "as long as you tell me we win." "Do we win, Margaret?" "We win," she said. "If we hold our nerve and play it out, we win. The truth's on our side, and the truth's on paper, and the paper's certified. We win." She paused. "But it's going to get worse before it does. Because Crab's a patient man, but he's not a saint, and the closer that note gets to coming due, the more he's going to push. He's going to want us broken before January, not just beaten. So brace yourself. The cruelest part's still coming. But we win, Nathan. Hold to that. We win." The cruelest part came the first week of December, and it came the way Margaret had known it would, with a smile and a piece of paper. Only this time, the paper was worse than a dam. Harlan Crabb rode up the Brooks Ranch Road one more time alone. Satchel across his saddle, smile fixed on his face, and this time when he climbed down, he didn't ask to sit. He just took a single folded paper from his satchel and held it out to Nathan, and he was enjoying himself. Anyone could see it, savoring it. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I'm sorry to bring hard news, but business is business." He held out the paper. "I've reviewed your account, and I'm afraid there's an irregularity. Your father's note. There's a clause, you see, a clause about the maintenance of the property's value. A borrower's obligation not to let the security fall into ruin. And, well..." He gestured out at the dry creek bed, at the herd worked thin from the hard well water, at the whole struggling look of the place. "Your herd's wasting. Your water's failed. The security on my note is deteriorating, which gives me the right, under the terms your father signed, to call the note early. Not in January, Mr. Brooks. Now." His smile widened. "The full $400, payable within 10 days. Or I foreclose, and Brooks Ranch herd, and all becomes the property of the Cattlemen's Bank." The yard had gone silent. Cyrus's hand had drifted toward his hip out of pure instinct, and Margaret saw it and said his name, soft, one word, and his hand drifted back. Nathan took the paper. He read it. His face was terrible. "You dried up my water," he said very low. "And now you're calling my note because my water's dry. You built the dam that's killing my herd, and now you'll take my ranch because the herd's dying." "I built a dam on my own land, Mr. Brooks. What the water does after that is the Lord's business, not mine." Crabb spread his soft hands. "I'm merely a banker protecting my security. 10 days, $400. I'd start saying your goodbyes." He was turning to remount the picture of a man who has won when Margaret spoke. "Mr. Crabb?" He turned back, still smiling. "Mrs. Brooks. Come to scold me again?" "No," Margaret said. "Come to ask you a question, just the one, for my own curiosity." She folded her hands in front of her, calm as still water, and the calm of her wiped just the edge off Crabb's smile, because a beaten woman doesn't stand that calm. "When you dammed the head of that creek, did you ever even once go to the county land office and check who held the water right?" A flicker, the smallest flicker behind Crabb's eyes. "The water right is attached to the land, Mrs. Brooks. I own the land the creek heads on. The water's mine." "Is it?" Margaret tilted her head. "You're certain of that? You'd stake your bank on it?" "I'd stake my..." Crabb stopped. The flicker came again, longer this time. "What are you driving at, woman?" "Nothing at all, Mr. Crabb. Just curiosity. It's only you struck me as a careful man, and a careful man before he built a dam to dry up a neighbor's herd. Why, I'd have thought a careful man would have ridden into Cheyenne and read the public record. Made sure the water was his to dam. It would have taken him an afternoon. Mr. Finch at the land office is most obliging." She let that sit a half-second. "But you didn't, did you? You assumed. Because the land was yours, you assumed the water was too. And in this territory, Mr. Crabb, as any careful man knows, the land and the water are two different things, filed in two different books." Her voice never rose. "You should have read the second book." The smile was entirely gone now. Harlan Crabb stood very still in the yard, and for the first time since he'd ridden up that road 2 months ago, the certainty had drained out of his face, and underneath it was something Margaret had been waiting 2 months to see. Doubt. The cold, creeping doubt of a clever man who has just realized he may not have been the cleverest man in the room after all. "You're bluffing," he said, but it didn't come out the way he meant it to. "Maybe I am," Margaret said. "It'd be the sensible thing, wouldn't it, for a desperate woman to bluff? You go on home and call our note, Mr. Crabb. Take your 10 days. Foreclose if you like." She smiled then for the first time, and it was a smaller and quieter and far more terrible smile than any Crabb had ever worn. "But before you do, you might want to ride into Cheyenne and read the second book, the water rights book. You might want to look up who's held the right to that creek for the last 30 years. And then you might want to think very carefully about what a federal judge will say to a banker who dammed a creek and stole the water of a man who owned every legal drop of it. Because the Marshal Mr. Crab, the United States Marshal, has been reading that second book for 3 weeks now, and he's coming. Not in January. Soon. She unfolded her hands. You called our note 10 days early. That was clever. But you built that dam 2 months too soon, and you never read the second book. And that, Mr. Crab, was the most expensive mistake of your life. For a long, long moment, Harlan Crab did not move. The smile was gone. The color was gone. And in his eyes, where the certainty had been, there was now the dawning, sickening understanding of a man who has just been shown the edge of a cliff he's already stepped off. Then, without a word, without his satchel snapping shut, without the smallest piece of the swagger he'd ridden in with, he mounted his fine bay horse and rode down the Brooks Ranch Road at a gallop hard toward Cheyenne, toward the land office, toward the second book. And every man in the yard watched him go. And Cyrus Doyle began slowly to laugh, and the laugh spread. And Pete was whooping, and Nathan stood with the foreclosure paper still in his hand, and stared at his wife as if he'd never truly seen her until this exact moment. "He's gone to read it," Cyrus said, wiping his eyes. "He's gone to read the second book. Lord Almighty, Margaret, did you see his face? Did you see his face when you said the Marshal?" "I saw it," Margaret said, but she wasn't laughing. She was watching the dust of Crab's hard ride settle on the road, and her own hands, she found, were not quite steady. "He's going to read it, and he's going to find out it's all true. And then he's going to be a cornered man, and a cornered man is the most dangerous kind there is. We've spooked him, but we haven't beaten him, not yet. He's got 10 days before the foreclosure, and he's got the Marshal coming, and he's just learned he stole water from a man who can put him in a federal prison." She turned to Nathan. "He's not going to fold. Not Harlan Crab. He's going to come back at us one more time harder than ever, because now he's not fighting for a ranch. He's fighting to keep himself out of a cell. And there is nothing on this earth more dangerous than a proud, clever, ruined man who's just realized the law is coming for him." The laughter in the yard died down. "What'll he do?" Nathan said quietly. "I don't know," Margaret said. "And that's what frightens me. I knew every move he'd make as long as he thought he was winning. But I don't know what a man like that does when he knows he's lost. Whether he runs or bargains, or burns the whole thing down so nobody can have it." She looked down the empty road where Crab had gone. "We've got 10 days till the foreclosure, and an unknown number till the Marshal comes. And somewhere between now and then, Harlan Crab is going to do the most dangerous thing he's ever done in his life. And we'd best be ready for it, every one of us. Because the next time that man comes up this road, he won't be smiling." He came back on the 4th day, and Margaret had been right about every part of it, but one. He wasn't smiling, and he didn't come alone. He came with 3 men, hard-faced riders, who weren't bank clerks, men with the look of having been hired in a saloon for cash and few questions. And he came at dusk when the light was failing, and the hands were tired, and he reined up in the yard and did not climb down. "Brooks?" His voice had changed. The oil was gone out of it. What was left was flat and dry and dangerous. "We're going to talk, you and I. Just us. Send the woman inside." Nathan came out onto the porch with Cyrus a half step behind him and Pete behind Cyrus, and the other hands drifting out of the barn and the bunkhouse drawn by the 3 strange riders, and the yard filled up slow and quiet with men on both sides who could feel that something had changed. "Anything you got to say to me, Crab, you say in front of my wife," Nathan said. "She's the reason you rode up here looking like a man who swallowed a hornet, so she'll hear it." Crab's jaw tightened. "I read the book," he said. "The second book. Your wife will be pleased to hear it. I rode into Cheyenne, and I read it, and I had my lawyer read it, and I had him read it twice." His eyes found Margaret where she stood in the doorway, and there was real hatred in them now, the pure, cold hatred of a powerful man for the person who has outwitted him. "The water right's yours. Old Elias Brooks. 30 years on the book and never moved. My lawyer says there's no breaking it. Says if it goes before a federal judge, I lose the dam, I lose a fine for the diversion, and likely I lose a good deal more besides." He paused. "Your wife's a clever woman, Brooks. Cleverer than you deserve. She's clever enough to have beat you," Nathan said. "So what are you doing back on my land with 3 hired guns, Crab? You've lost. Take down your dam and ride home. I haven't lost yet." Crab leaned forward in his saddle. "Here's where we are, Brooks, so listen close. The marshal's coming, yes, maybe a week out, maybe 2. But until he gets here, I still hold your note. I still called it. You've got 6 days left to put $400 in my hand, or I foreclose water right or no water right. The foreclosure's legal. The note's legal. My lawyer's certain of it. So here's my offer, and it's the last one you'll get." He straightened. "You sign the ranch over to me tonight quiet, and in exchange I'll take down the dam, and I'll forget all about the foreclosure. And when the marshal comes, I'll tell him the whole water business was an honest misunderstanding between neighbors, all settled friendly. You walk away with your lives and your herd money. Or—" his voice dropped. "You refuse and I foreclose in 6 days, and I take the ranch anyway through the note, and when the marshal comes, I tell him you forged that water right to extort me, and I've got 3 men here who'll swear they saw you do it. Your word against mine and theirs. A rancher behind on his note against a banker, and 3 witnesses." He smiled finally, but it was a wolf smile all teeth. Think on which story a judge believes Brooks: the desperate debtors or the banks. The yard had gone dead still. The threat was naked now, all the smiling stripped off it, and it was uglier than anything Crab had done yet. He'd lost the water. So now he meant to win another way by forgery and false witness, by turning Margaret's own clever proof into the very thing that hanged them. Nathan's hand had gone white on the porch rail. Cyrus had gone still in the particular way of a man deciding whether to reach for something. And Margaret in the doorway felt the whole thing tilt, felt how close it was, how a lie told by a powerful man with 3 paid witnesses could undo every true thing she'd found. She stepped out onto the porch. "Mr. Crab?" Her voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something the men had never heard in it before, a cold edge honed sharp. "You'd swear my husband forged a 30-year-old county record, in a book kept by Albert Finch under Finch's seal in Finch's hand, that's never left the land office in 30 years. That's your story. That's my story, and these men will back it. And when the federal judge asks how a rancher in the North Country reached into a sealed county ledger and forged an entry in handwriting 40 years old in ink that's aged 30 years on a page bound into a book that's never left a locked office, what'll your 3 men say to that, Mr. Crab?" She took a step forward. "You didn't think it through. You never do. That's your whole trouble. You're clever in the first move and a fool by the third. You can't forge a 30-year-old bound record, and you know it, and Finch will say it under oath. And Finch is a federal appointed clerk with 40 years standing and no debt to your bank. You're 3 saloon men against Albert Finch and the United States record. That's the trade you're offering a judge." She shook her head slow. "No, you're not here because you think that lie will hold. You're here because you're frightened, and frightened men come with guns and bluster, hoping the other fellow's more frightened than they are." Her voice went very quiet. "I'm not more frightened than you, Mr. Crab. I've been frightened my whole life by men a great deal poorer than you and a great deal meaner. You don't scare me even a little." One of the hired men shifted his horse and his hand moved, and the whole yard moved with it, every Brooks hand going tense, and for one breath it hung there, the whole thing balanced on a hair, and into that breath Margaret said the thing that broke it. "Pete," she said, not turning her eyes, never leaving Crab. "Tell Mr. Crab what came in the post this morning." Pete swallowed. His voice cracked and steadied. "A letter, ma'am, from the marshal's office. Said the marshal's reviewed the water filing and found it good, and he's riding out and he'll be here Thursday." He looked at Crab. "Thursday, Mr. Crab, day after tomorrow. Not a week. Not 2. Thursday." It was a lie. The letter had not come. But Margaret had judged her man, and she watched the lie land, Watched Thursday go into Harlan Crab like a blade. Watched the last of his certainty drain out through the bottom of his boots. Because a week he could have used a week he could have worked with. But the day after tomorrow gave him no time to forge anything, no time to arrange anything, no time to do anything but be there in the yard with 3 hired guns and a damned creek and a stolen water right when the United States Marshal rode up the road. "You're lying," Crab said. But it was the second time he'd said those words to her, and the second time they came out with no force in them at all. "Maybe I am," Margaret said, the same as before. "You've 6 days till your foreclosure, and the marshal comes Thursday. You want to bet which arrives first. You want to be standing in this yard with 3 paid witnesses and a forgery story when a federal marshal rides up and asks what you're all doing here." She folded her hands. "Here's my counteroffer, Mr. Crab, and it's the only one you'll get from me. Take your men and your dam and your foreclosure paper and ride home tonight. Tear down that dam by morning, let the water run. And when the marshal comes Thursday, you tell him the truth that you made a mistake about the water, an honest one, and you fixed it the moment you understood. Do that, and maybe the judge goes easy. A fine instead of a cell. A reprimand instead of ruin." She let it sit. "Or stand here and bluster and threaten and wait for Thursday and let the marshal find you mid-crime, dam still up, gun still out, and go before that judge as a man caught red-handed threatening a family on their own land. Your choice. But you've got till morning to decide, and the water's got to be running when the marshal comes, or there's no mercy left in this for you at all." It was a masterstroke, and every man in the yard knew it, even the men who couldn't have named why. She'd offered the wolf a way out that wasn't really a way out, a door that led only to a smaller cage, and she'd done it so that the alternative was the gallows, and a cornered wolf takes the cage over the gallows every time. Harlan Crab sat his fine bay horse in the failing light, and the war went across his face plain for all to see, the fury and the fear, and the cold banker's arithmetic, finally working out the sum that Margaret had worked out days before. He could not win. The water was hers. The clerk would not break. The marshal was coming. And every hour he stayed here with guns drawn dug his hole deeper. "This isn't finished," he said. But it was. They could all hear that it was. "It is Mr. Crab," Margaret said almost gently. "It's been finished since the day your grandfather's bank foreclosed on Pruitt's land and never thought to check the water. You just didn't know it till now. Go home. Tear down the dam. It's the only road left that doesn't end in a cell." For one more moment Crab sat there. Then he yanked his horse around, and the 3 hired men yanked theirs around after him, and they rode down the Brooks Ranch road into the dusk, and they did not gallop this time. They went slow, the slow defeated walk of men who have nowhere left to hurry to, and the Brooks hands stood in the yard and watched them go, and nobody made a sound until the dark had swallowed them whole. Then Pete let out a breath, like he'd been holding it a year. "Ma'am," he said, "that letter from the marshal, it never come, did it?" "No, Pete," Margaret said, "it never came." "You lied to his face about a federal marshal." "I did." Margaret's hands were shaking again now that it was over, now that there was no one watching but her own people. "I judged that the truth wasn't fast enough to save us, and a man like Crab only understands a clock that's running out. So I gave him a clock. The marshal's coming, Pete. That part's true. I've the letters to prove I wrote him. I just don't know that it's Thursday. Might be next week. Might be the week after." She let out a shaky breath. "But Crab doesn't know that. And by the time he finds out, the dam will be down, and the water will be running, and the worst of it'll be over, and a marshal arriving late to find a creek flowing free and a family safe on their land is a very different thing than a marshal arriving to find guns drawn and a dam up." She looked at Nathan. "I gambled. Again. I keep gambling your ranch, Nathan, and I keep telling myself it's the last time." Nathan came across the porch and took both her shaking hands in his. "Gamble it every day for the rest of my life," he said low and rough. "Gamble it every single day if you'll keep winning like that." "Margaret, I have never in my life seen anything like what you just did. He came up here with 3 guns and a story that could have hanged me, and you sent him home with his tail between his legs, And never raised your voice once. He shook his head. How? How do you do it? How do you stand in front of a man like that and not break? Because I've been broken before, Margaret said simply. By smaller men than him, over smaller things, more times than I could count. And every time I broke, I learned a little more about what breaking costs, and a little more about how to bend instead. By the time Harlan Crabb rode up that road, there wasn't anything left in me for a man like him to break. He brought a hammer to a thing that's already been hammered flat its whole life. She squeezed his hands. That's the secret nobody tells you, Nathan. The people the world spends its whole time trying to break, we're the ones you can't break, because we've already survived the breaking. It's the men who've never been told no who shatter the first time they hear it. Crabb's never heard no in his life. That's why he came apart tonight, and that's why he'll tear down that dam by morning, because deep down, he's soft, and I'm not, and he finally figured out which of us was which. By the next morning, the dam was down. Cyrus rode up to the head of the creek at first light to see for himself, and he came back at a gallop, whooping his hat in his hand, and the water was running. The creek was full, and moving and singing in its bed, the way it hadn't moved in 3 weeks, and the herd brought back to the north sections plunged its heads into the cold, clear water and drank, and the bawling stopped, and a quiet came over Brooks Ranch that was the first real peace any of them had felt since the fever. Crabb had torn it down in the night, quiet, no notice, no word. He'd weighed Margaret's smaller cage against the gallows of a marshal finding him mid-crime, and he'd chosen the cage exactly as she'd known he would. The marshal did not come Thursday. Thursday came and went, and Margaret spent the whole of it sick with the fear that Crabb would learn the truth, would ride back up the road realizing he'd been bluffed. And she kept Pete posted at the gate all day, watching the road, but Crabb never came. He was in Cheyenne, it turned out, with his lawyer doing the only thing left to a clever cornered man which was trying to build himself a defense for when the marshal did come. The marshal came the following Tuesday. His name was Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Reeve, and he was a spare, gray, unhurried man who had spent 20 years in the territories and was not impressed by bankers, and he rode up the Brooks Ranch Road with 2 deputies and a saddlebag full of papers, and the first thing he did was not talk to Nathan. It was ask plainly for the woman who'd written him the letters. "That'd be my wife," Nathan said. "Margaret. Then it's your wife I've come to see," Reeves said, and he climbed down. "Ma'am, I've read your letters, all 4 of them. And I've corresponded with a Mr. Albert Finch at the county land office who confirms every word of them with his seal. And I've ridden up here to tell you that in 20 years of this work, I have rarely seen a clearer case, nor one laid out by a sharper hand. You ought to have been a lawyer, ma'am." "They don't let women be lawyers, Mr. Reeve," Margaret said. "More's the pity. You'd have made a terror of one." He pulled a paper from his saddlebag. "Now, this dam Mr. Crabb built. I'll need to see where it stood, and I'll need to see the dry bed it left and any losses to your herd I can record, because the territorial court's going to want damages, and I aim to get them for you." "The dam's already down," Cyrus said. "Crabb tore it down 4 nights back." Reeve raised an eyebrow. "Did he now? Before I even arrived?" A slow, dry smile crossed the marshal's weathered face. Now how would a man know to tear down his own dam 4 nights before a marshal he didn't know was coming? He looked at Margaret, and the smile deepened. Unless somebody gave him reason to think the marshal was closer than he was. Margaret looked back at him even and unashamed. "I may have mentioned a Thursday, Mr. Reeve." "You may have." Reeve actually laughed, a short, dry bark of a laugh. "Ma'am, that's not strictly legal, telling a man a federal officer's arriving on a day he isn't. But I'll tell you what it is. It's the reason that creek's running today instead of next month, and a creek running is a great deal more use to a court than a creek dry. The dam's down, the water's flowing, and the man did it himself, which a judge will read as a guilty conscience plain as a confession." He folded the paper away. "I won't be reporting the Thursday. Far as my report's concerned, the dam came down because the good Lord moved Harlan Crabb's heart. Now, show me that creek, and then I'll be riding into Cheyenne to have a long conversation with the gentleman about water law and about 3 men he hired in a saloon, word of which has already reached me, because saloons leak worse than any dam. The case against Harlan Crabb took the better part of 2 months to wind through the territorial court, and Margaret was at every day of it, sitting in the gallery in her good dress with the tin box of certified copies on her lap. And when the territorial judge needed a fact about the water filing or a date from the record, it was Margaret the lawyers turned to because she knew that record better than any man in the room. Crabb fought it the only ways he had left. He claimed the misunderstanding had been honest. The judge looked at the 3 saloon men he'd tried to hire as false witnesses whose names Reeve had gotten and whose statements Reeve had taken, and did not find the misunderstanding very honest at all. Crabb claimed the foreclosure was separate from the water, a legitimate banking matter. The judge looked at the timing. The note called early on the grounds that the herd was failing. The herd failing because the water crab himself had stolen was damned, and did not find the foreclosure very separate either. In the end, the judge's ruling was everything Margaret had said it would be, the night she first read that 30-year-old line by lamplight. The water right was confirmed to the Brooks family beyond any further challenge. The dam was ordered to remain down in perpetuity. Crabb was fined heavily for the diversion, and fined again for the attempt to procure false witnesses, which the judge called a fraud upon the court, and very nearly sent him to prison for outright. And the foreclosure. The early calling of the note was thrown out entire as an act of bad faith, the judge ruling that no bank could engineer the ruin of a property and then foreclose upon the ruin it had engineered. But the judge went further than that, and it was the going further that nobody had expected, not even Margaret. He looked into the Cattlemen's Bank of Cheyenne. Once a federal marshal and a territorial judge start turning over a banker's papers, they rarely stop at one creek. And what they found in Crabb's books was that the trick he'd tried to play on Brooks Ranch was a trick he'd played before, and played successfully on a dozen ranches and farms across the valley. Dam the water, or foreclose on a bad season, or call a note early on some buried clause, and take good land for a fraction of its worth. He'd built half his bank's holdings that way on ruined families who'd never had a Margaret to read the second book for them. The court ordered an accounting of all of it. Some of the ruined families got their land back. Some got damages. And Harlan Crabb, who had ridden up the Brooks Ranch Road 3 times, certain he was the cleverest man in Wyoming, lost his banking charter, lost the better part of his fortune to fines and restitution, and rode out of the territory a broken man, undone in the end, not by a bigger banker or a faster gun, but by a heavy woman from Kansas who had simply patiently read the papers he had not. Word of it went through the valley like the fever had only. This time the thing that spread was not death, but a story, and the story was this. The fat kitchen wife from Brooks Ranch had taken down Harlan Crabb, not just beaten him, ruined him, read his own bank's papers better than his own lawyers, and broke him in a federal court, and got a dozen families their land back besides. And the valley which had laughed at her began ranch by ranch to come up the Brooks Ranch Road. They came shy at first. A neighbor with a question about water rights having heard. A farmer's widow who'd lost her place to Crabb years back and wanted to know if Margaret thought she had any chance of getting it returned. A young rancher who couldn't make his books balance, and had heard he'd heard the woman at Brooks Ranch had a way with figures. Margaret saw every one of them. She sat them at the long table, where she'd read the ledgers her first night, and she poured them coffee, and she listened, and she read their papers, slow line by line, and she found their cracks, and their clauses, and their buried rights, the same way she'd found her own. She never charged a cent. When the young rancher tried to press money on her, she pushed it back across the table. "Put it toward your note," she said. "And next time you sign a paper, read every line of it before you make your mark, and if there's a word in it you don't understand, you don't sign till somebody explains it." "That's all I did, son. I read the words. There's no magic in it. There's just the reading, and most folks are too proud or too scared or too hurried to do it. Don't be most folks." The farmer's widow got her land back. It took 4 months and 3 trips to the county court, but Margaret found the flaw in the foreclosure Crabb had run on her, and the new bank, chastened and watched now by the territory, gave the place back rather than fight it. The widow wept at Margaret's table, The way Cyrus had wept, the way Margaret herself had wept, the morning the herd held against the fever, and Margaret held her hand and let her weep, and said the thing she'd taken to saying to all of them. You weren't a fool for losing it. You were a person who trusted that the papers said what they were supposed to say, and there were men who made their living betting you wouldn't read them close. That's not your shame, it's theirs. But now you know. Now you read every line. And now you tell every other woman in this valley to do the same, because that's how we stop them, not one ranch at a time, but all of us reading. It was around that time in the deep of that first winter after Crab that Nathan finally said the thing he'd been failing to say for months. He found Margaret at the table, late the way he always found her. The ledgers opened the lamp low, and he sat down across from her in the chair that had become his, and he didn't reach for any papers. And after a while she looked up and saw that he was just watching her, and that his face was working with something. Nathan, what is it? Is it the Aldous account I told him we'd... It's not the Aldous account. He turned his hat in his hands the way Cyrus had the night he came to apologize. Margaret, I've got to say a thing, and I've been failing to say it for a long while because I'm not a man that's good with saying things, and because I'm afraid of saying it wrong and having you think it's less than it is. He stopped, started again. When I placed that advertisement, for a wife to salt beef, I want you to know what I was. I was a man who'd given up. I'd given up on the ranch mostly, and I'd given up on myself entire, and I'd given up so complete on the notion that any good thing might come to me that I couldn't even bring myself to ask for a wife. I asked for a hand, a worker. Because asking for a wife, a real one, a partner that takes hope, and I didn't have any hope left to spend. He looked up at her. And then you got off that wagon, and every man on this place saw your size and laughed. And I'll be honest with you, Margaret, because you've earned honesty in that first second. Some part of me saw it too, the way they saw it, because I was a coward and a fool, and a man with no hope, and it would have been easy to see you the way they did. Margaret had gone very still. But you opened your mouth, Nathan went on, and you asked to see my books before you'd washed the trail off your hands, and something in me woke up that I thought had died with my father. And every day since you've woke up a little more of it. The grazing, the fever, the water, Crab. Every single time you've shown me a thing I couldn't see, and the thing I couldn't see was never just about cattle. It was about what's possible. You walk through the world, and where everybody else sees a dead end, you see a door, and you've spent these months teaching me to see the doors, and... His voice broke, and he pushed through it. And somewhere in all of it, I stopped seeing a wife I'd hired to salt beef, and I started seeing the bravest, sharpest, kindest person I have ever known in my life. And I fell in love with you, Margaret, so deep and so complete that I can't remember what it was to not love you. And I've been too much a coward to say it, because I was afraid you'd married me out of need and didn't feel the same, and I'd shame us both. The lamp burned low between them. Margaret's eyes were bright, and her hands were flat on the ledger, and for a long moment she could not speak at all. Nathan Brooks, she finally said, and her voice was not steady. Do you know what I expected when I got on that train to Wyoming? What? The same thing I'd had with my first husband, a man who needed my back and my hands and would tolerate the rest of me as the price of getting them. I expected to be useful and unloved, because that's the only arrangement any man had ever offered me, and I'd made my peace with it, or told myself I had. I packed for a life of being needed and never wanted. Her voice cracked. And then a man pushed a ledger across a table and said, "Show me," and meant it, and asked me what I thought, and listened to the answer, and stood in front of every hand he had, and bet his father's ranch on my word. Not once, but 3 times, and never, not one single time in all these months, looked at me the way every other man in my life has looked at me. She put her hand to her mouth and took it away. You ask if I married you out of need and don't feel the same. Nathan, I've loved you since the night you said you believed me. Not that you'd settle for me, that you believed me. No man had ever said that to me in my life, and you said it our first week, and I've loved you every day since, and been just as much a coward as you, because I was certain that a man only loved me for my use, and that the day I stopped being useful, you'd see me the way the rest of them did. So I kept being useful. I kept solving things. Part of me thought if I just kept saving the ranch, you'd never have cause to look close and stop loving you. Nathan was around the table now, on his knees beside her chair, his rough hands taking her face. Margaret, you could never solve another problem the rest of your life. You could sit in that chair and do nothing but breathe. And I'd love you till the day they put me in the ground next to my father. It was never the saving. The saving's how I came to know you. But it's you I love. The mind, yes, the Lord knows the mind. But the heart of you, the way you handed Cyrus back his pride, the way you won't charge those widows a cent, the way you wept when the herd held, that's what I love. Not what you do, what you are. And Margaret Hayes, who had been told her whole life by her whole world that she was a thing to be tolerated and never a thing to be treasured, who had armored herself in usefulness, because usefulness was the only love she'd ever been allowed, broke open at last, at that low table in the lamplight, and wept and let herself be held by a man who loved her not for her back or her hands, or even her brilliant mind, but for the whole of who she was. They held each other a long time, and when the weeping was done, Margaret laughed wet and shaky and pressed her forehead to his. "We're a fine pair," she said, "two cowards who loved each other half a year and couldn't say it. Brave as lions about cattle and banks," Nathan agreed, "and yellow as dogs about this." "Well," she wiped her eyes, "we've said it now. We've said it now." The spring came, and it was the spring everyone had warned would never come. The spring. Crab had bet against the spring the whole valley had assumed would see Brooks Ranch foreclosed and empty. Instead, it saw Brooks Ranch, the only outfit in the valley with a full, healthy herd. The only outfit that hadn't lost its stock to the fever, or its land to the bank, sitting on cattle, worth just as Margaret had told Crab across the porch table 3 and 4 times what the panicked ranches could get for theirs. Buyers came from as far as Cheyenne and Laramie and farther, and the beef Brooks Ranch shipped that spring brought a price that paid off the note entire, with money left over. Real money, more than old Brooks had ever held in his life. Nathan stood at the railhead and watched the cattle load and held the bank draft in his hand, and could not quite believe the figure on it. "We did it," he kept saying. "Margaret, we did it. The note's paid. We own it. We own it clear." "You own it clear," Margaret said. "We," Nathan said fierce. "We. And I'll thank you not to start with that, because we're going into Cheyenne tomorrow to the county office, and we're putting your name on that deed beside mine. Full partner. Equal share your name right there in the book next to mine for 30 years and forever. So the next time some Harlan Crab comes reading the second book, he finds Margaret Brooks on the title plain as day. You hear me?" Margaret heard him. And the next day they rode into Cheyenne, and Albert Finch himself, beaming, entered her name into the deed book beside Nathan's full and equal owner of Brooks Ranch, and the dusty old clerk shook her hand across the counter and said it was the proudest entry he'd made in 40 years. The ranch grew after that, the way a thing grows when the brake's been taken off it, with the note paid and the herd whole, and Margaret's systems running every part of the operation. Brooks Ranch did more than survive. It began to swallow up the ground around it. The ruined ranches, the ones the fever had emptied, and the ones Crab had bled, came up for sale cheap, and Margaret bought them carefully, one at a time, the good land with good water, and folded them into Brooks Ranch, until the spread had doubled, and then doubled again. She dug new wells on the new land because she'd learned the lesson of the creek, and never again would Brooks cattle drink from water the family didn't own outright. She built new barns, raised new curing sheds, dry ones off the ground the way she'd shown them that first autumn. She hired the hands the failed ranches had turned loose, and she paid them fair, and she ran the whole growing operation by the book, every head and every dollar written down in her steady hand. And the hand she hired came not just for the wages, but for the thing that had gotten around the whole territory, now that Brooks Ranch was run by a woman who saw what no one else saw, and that a man who worked under Margaret Brooks learned more in a season than he'd learn in 10 years anywhere else. Cowboys who'd have laughed her off a horse 2 years before now asked hat in hand if there might be a place for them at Brooks Ranch under Mrs. Brooks's management, and they meant the Mrs. Brooks part as the draw. Cyrus Doyle watched it all happen from his place at her right-hand foreman of the biggest spread in the valley now. And one evening near the end of that first full year, he stood with her at the rail, looking out over a south range full of fat cattle on rotated grass, and he said the thing that had been building in him a long time. "You know what you done, Margaret, past the ranch, past Crab, past all of it?" "What's that, Cyrus?" "You changed how it's done. The whole valley. They're all rotating their grass now, every outfit that survived. They're all keeping books like yours. They're all reading their own water rights because they heard what happened to the ones who didn't. There's widows in this valley own their land today that'd be turned out and starving if you hadn't read their papers for free." He shook his head slow. "Old Brooks built a ranch. You built, I don't even know the word for it. You built a different valley, a fairer one. One where a banker can't just take what he wants because folks were too scared to read." He looked at her. "And you done it as the woman they all laughed at. That's the part I can't get over. You done it as her." Margaret was quiet a moment, watching the cattle, the grass, the water running clear in the creek that was hers in law, and would always be now. "That's the only way it could have been done, Cyrus," she said finally. "By her. By the woman they laughed at. Because the women they laugh at, we're the ones who know what it costs to be on the bottom of a thing, and so we're the only ones who'll bother to reach back down for the next one." She put her hand on the rail. "A man like Crab, he climbs up and pulls the ladder after him. But somebody who got told their whole life they didn't deserve to climb at all, when they finally get up here, the first thing they do is reach back down. It's the only thing that makes the climb mean anything." She smiled, small and certain. "So no, it couldn't have been anyone else. It had to be her. It had to be the fat kitchen wife, because she was the only one who'd remember the bottom once she reached the top." And out across the growing spread in the long gold light of evening, the cattle grazed on rested grass, and the water ran clear and free, and the woman, everyone in the territory had laughed at, stood at the rail of the largest ranch in the valley, her name on the deed, and her husband's love in her heart, and 100 families' gratitude at her back, and she had built every inch of it, not with her hands, though those were strong, and not even with her mind, though that was the sharpest in the territory, but with the one thing the world had been so sure she didn't possess, that it had never bothered to look. Worth. 10 years did to Brooks Ranch what 10 years of clear water and clear books and clear purpose will do to any piece of ground given over to someone who finally knows how to tend it. The spread that had been a dying 40-head outfit on exhausted grass became the largest cattle operation in the territory, and then the largest for 3 territories around, and the cattle that wore the Brooks brand commanded a price at every railhead from Cheyenne to Kansas City, because a buyer who saw that brand knew the beef behind it had been raised right, fed right, cured right, and counted right, every pound of it, by the woman whose name sat on the deed. They were good years. The kind of years a person earns, and then having earned them, almost can't believe are real. Margaret never slowed. The hands who'd come to her green grew into foremen, and she trained each one the way she'd trained Pete that first frightened autumn, by trusting them with a thing and letting them carry it. Pete himself, the boy who'd checked the east gate at 2 a.m. during the fever, was a grown man now, with a wife and a daughter, and a foreman's wages running the whole north range of an operation he'd helped save when he was 20 and too scared to finish a sentence about Margaret's size. He came to her one spring with his hat in his hands, the way men always came to Margaret when a thing mattered. "Mrs. Brooks, my girl, my Sarah. She's 8 now, and she's sharp, ma'am, sharp as a tack, sharper than her daddy ever was. And I want—" He stopped, embarrassed. "I want her to learn it. The figuring, the books, the way you see things. I've been thinking if it ain't too much to ask if you'd ever have the time, maybe she could sit with you sometimes. When you do the books, just to watch, just to learn how a woman can be how she can be that, what you are." Margaret looked at the man. This man who'd been a frightened boy mocking her at a water trough a decade ago, now standing in her parlor, asking her to teach his daughter to be like her. And something turned over in her chest that took her a moment to name, because she'd felt it so rarely in her life that she'd half forgotten its shape. It was the feeling of a circle closing. "Bring her tomorrow," Margaret said. "Bring her every day she'll come. I'll teach her every single thing I know, Pete. And when I've run out of things to teach her, I'll find her somebody who knows more, because a girl that sharp shouldn't ever hit the end of what she's allowed to learn. Not while I'm breathing." She paused. "And Pete, thank you. You don't know what it is to be asked to be the thing a man wants his daughter to grow into. After the life I had, you don't know what that is." "I think I might, ma'am," Pete said quietly. "I think the whole valley knows what you are now. We just took a while figuring it out. I'm sorry it took us a while." "You were 20 and the world had told you what to think. You unlearned it. That's more than most folks ever do." She smiled. "Bring me your Sarah. Let's see if she's as sharp as you say." Sarah was sharper. She sat at the long table where Margaret had read the ledgers her first desperate night on the ranch, and she took to figures the way some children take to horses, fearless and natural. And within 2 years, she could find a flaw in a column faster than half the grown men on the ranch. And Margaret watched the girl's mind unfold and felt every single day the deepest satisfaction she had ever known, deeper even than the herd holding against the fever, deeper than breaking crab. Because this was the one thing she'd never once been given and was now giving freely. She was teaching a girl that her worth was in her mind and saying it to her early, before the world could ever tell her different. The newspapers came eventually the way they always come once a thing gets big enough. A reporter from the Cheyenne paper rode out to do a piece on the largest ranch in the territory, and then a reporter from Denver, and then one from back east, from a paper in Chicago that did features on the great cattle operations of the West, and every one of them rode up the long road to the main house intending to write the same story. The story of Nathan Brooks, the successful cattleman, the rancher who'd built an empire out of his father's failing spread. And every single one of them got the same correction. The Chicago man was the most insistent. He sat across from Nathan in the parlor with his notebook and his questions, and he kept calling it Nathan's achievement, Nathan's vision, Nathan's empire. And finally, Nathan set down his coffee and stopped him. "Son," he said, "you keep writing down that I built this. I want you to put down your pencil and listen to me, because I'm only going to say this the once, and I want you to print it exactly the way I say it, because if you don't, I'll write your editor myself." The reporter put down his pencil. "When my father died," Nathan said, "this ranch was dying with him. I had 40 head of sick cattle on grass burned to dust, a note I couldn't pay, and no notion in my head of how to fix any of it. I'd given up. I want that printed. The man you came to write about had given up. I placed an advertisement for a wife to salt my beef, because I couldn't even imagine a future big enough to hope for just a winter I might survive if somebody helped me cure the meat." He leaned forward. And a woman answered that advertisement. A woman the whole territory laughed at when she stepped off the wagon on account of her size. And I'll tell you the truth, son, in my lowest moment, I near laughed too. And that woman walked into my dying ranch, and before she'd washed the trail dust off her hands, she asked to see my books. And in one night she found money I'd been bleeding for years. And over the next year, she saved my herd from a fever that wiped out every other outfit in this valley. And she beat a banker who'd ruined a dozen families, beat him in a federal court with nothing but a 30-year-old water right. She dug out of a county book that nobody else had ever bothered to read. And then she took the money we made, and she built this, all of this. Every acre, every well, every barn, every system that makes this the best-run ranch in 3 territories. The reporter was writing fast now. "So you put down your pencil and you listen," Nathan said. "This ranch wasn't saved by me. It wasn't built by me. It was saved by my wife. It was built by my wife. Her name is Margaret Brooks, and she is the finest mind and the finest heart in this whole territory. And the only thing I ever did right in my entire life was have the sense to believe her when every other man would have laughed her off the place. You came out here to write a story about a successful cattleman. There isn't one. There's a successful cattlewoman and a lucky husband who knows it. Print that. Print exactly that." The reporter printed it. The piece ran in Chicago, under a headline about the woman who built the West's greatest ranch, and it got picked up and reprinted. And somewhere back east, women who had never seen a cow in their lives read about a heavy widow from Kansas who had been told no man would ever want her, and who had built an empire and beaten the men who laughed, and they cut the article out and they kept it because everyone everywhere knows what it is to be looked at and found wanting, and everyone needs to know it isn't the end of the story. Margaret read the Chicago piece at the long table one evening, and when she finished it, she set it down and was quiet a long while. "You shouldn't have done that," she said finally. "Told him it was all me." "It wasn't all me, Nathan. You believed me. None of it happens without that. A mind's no use if there's nobody who'll listen to it. You were the listening." "Then he can write a second article about the listening," Nathan said. "But the first one's going to say who built it, because the world spent 30 years telling you you were nothing but a body, to be tolerated, and I aim to spend the rest of my life telling it louder that it was wrong. I'll correct every reporter, every neighbor, every fool who ever calls this my ranch till the day I die. It's yours. You built it. The world's going to know your name." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You never wanted recognition. I know that. You only ever wanted a place where you could belong. Well, you built one. And now I'm going to make sure the whole world knows whose place it is." Margaret didn't argue with him again. She'd learned over 10 years that there were some things Nathan needed to do as much as she'd ever needed to read a ledger, and saying her name to the world was one of them. It was how he loved her. So she let him. But it was true what she'd told him. She had never wanted the recognition. She'd told him on a dark night 10 years before that all she'd ever wanted was a place where she could belong, and she'd meant it. And the strange thing, the thing that still caught her sometimes in the quiet of an evening, was that she'd gotten it. Not the recognition, though, that had come. The belonging. She belonged here at this table, in this valley, in this life more completely than she had ever belonged anywhere, and the belonging hadn't come from the ranch or the money or the famous name. It had come from the people. It had come from Cyrus Gray, and stooped now, but still riding out every morning, who had called her a fat kitchen wife, and become the most loyal man she'd ever known, who treated her with a fierce protective devotion that no slight from any stranger could ever penetrate. Because he'd been the stranger once, and he'd learned, and a man who's learned guards the lesson hardest of all. It had come from Pete, and from Pete's Sarah, and from the dozen other hands she'd trained, and the children she'd started teaching, a whole little school of them. Now ranch children and town children, boys and girls both, who came to the long table to learn their figures from Mrs. Brooks. Because Mrs. Brooks believed a sharp mind was a sharp mind, and didn't care a whit which kind of body it came in. It had come from the widows. There were 11 of them by the end, 11 families who'd lost their land to Crab, or to some other smiling man with a clause, and who had it back now, because Margaret had read their papers for free, and found their cracks, and walked them through the courts. And those 11 families would have walked through fire for Margaret Brooks, and every one of them had learned to read their own papers close, and had taught their children, and the lessons spread out through the valley, like water finding its level, until there was hardly a family left that could be robbed the easy old way, because they'd all learned to read the second book. That was the thing Margaret was proudest of in the end, prouder than the ranch, prouder than the famous name. She had changed how it was done. A banker couldn't come into that valley anymore and take a family's land with a buried clause, because the families read the clauses now. All of them, because a heavy woman from Kansas had taught them that reading was the difference between keeping a thing and losing it, and that nobody was too poor or too plain or too laughed at to read. The years went on, and they were good, and they were full, and if there was one sorrow in them, it was a quiet one that Margaret carried without complaint, which was that she and Nathan never had children of their own. It hadn't come. Some things don't. And in the early years, it had grieved her in the night, the old fear surfacing that her body had failed her at the one thing the world claimed a woman's body was for, the old voice whispering that this too was a way she fell short. It was Nathan who put that voice to rest the way he'd put so many to rest. "Margaret," he said the night he found her grieving it quiet by the window. "Look out there, Look at Pete, Sarah, and the Hendricks boys, and the whole little crowd of them that comes to your table to learn. Look at the children of 11 families that have homes today because of you. You think you don't have children? He came and stood behind her. You've got more children than any woman in this territory. You've got a whole valley of them, every child whose folks didn't get turned out, every girl who's growing up watching you and learning she can be more than they'll tell her she can be. You didn't fail at being a mother. You just became one to more children than one body could ever hold. That Sarah's going to run a ranch one day on what you taught her. That's yours. She's yours, same as if you'd born her, and so are all of them. And Margaret looked out at the long evening light over the largest ranch in the territory, and she thought about all those children at her table, and she let the old voice go. For good, that time. She never grieved it again. Nathan was right the way he'd learned to be right, by learning to see the world the way she saw it, by learning to find the door where everyone else saw a wall. She had a valley full of children. She had taught a generation to read the words that the powerful had always counted on them not reading. That was a kind of motherhood the world didn't have a name for, but it was hers, and it would outlast her by 100 years. Cyrus passed in the 14th year in his sleep, an old man who'd lived to see the ranch he'd feared was dying, become the greatest in the West. And at his grave, it was Margaret who spoke, because Cyrus had asked it of her months before, when he knew his time was short. "I want you to do it," he'd told her, gruff, embarrassed the way he'd been the night he wept at her table. "Not the preacher. You, because you're the one who—" He'd stopped. "Margaret, I called you a thing I'm ashamed of that first day, and you handed me back my pride when you had every right to break it. I've spent 14 years trying to be worth what you saw in me that I couldn't see in myself. You're the one who knew me. So you say the words over me. Nobody else." So she said the words over him, and what she said was the truth, that Cyrus Doyle had been a proud man who'd made a proud man's mistake, and had then done the rarest thing a proud man can do, which is to change completely, and become better than he'd been, and to spend the rest of his life loyal to the very person who'd shown him he was wrong. "There's no harder thing in this world than admitting you were wrong about a person," she said, standing at his grave with the whole valley gathered to hear it. Cyrus did it. He did it complete. And he spent 14 years making it right, and there is not a man I have ever known I respected more, because the easiest thing in the world is to stay wrong, and Cyrus Doyle was too good a man to take the easy road. Rest now, Cyrus. You earned it. You were the truest friend I ever had, and I will miss you every day of my life." And the whole valley wept, because they'd all watched it happen, the long, slow turning of Cyrus Doyle, from the woman's loudest enemy into her staunchest friend, and they all understood that his story was their story, the story of the whole valley, which had laughed at Margaret Brooks, and then learned the hard way and the slow way exactly what she was. Nathan grew old beside her, and they were happy with the deep, worn happiness of two people who'd been cowards about their love once and had spent the rest of their lives making up for the lost half-year. He never stopped correcting reporters. He never stopped saying her name. On their 30th anniversary, an old man now, he stood up at the supper table in front of the whole gathered crowd of them, the foremen and their families and the children Margaret had taught, and the widows she'd saved, and he raised his glass. 30 years ago, he said, his voice cracked with age but steady, "I placed an advertisement for a wife to salt my beef. It was the most foolish, smallest, most hopeless thing a man ever wrote, because I'd given up on the notion that anything good could come to me, and so I asked for the smallest good thing I could imagine, a pair of hands to cure my meat." He looked down the table at Margaret, white-haired now, herself, her eyes bright as they'd been the first morning. "And God, who has a sense of humor, sent me instead, the greatest partner, the greatest mind, the greatest heart, and the greatest love that any man in the history of this territory was ever lucky enough to be handed. I asked for a hand to salt beef. I was given a queen, and I spent 30 years not deserving her and loving her anyway, and I would not trade one single day of it for all the cattle in the West." He raised his glass higher. "To Margaret Brooks, who they all laughed at, who saved a ranch and broke a wicked man and gave 11 families back their homes and taught a whole valley to read and built the greatest spread in the West, out of nothing but her own God-given worth. The world looked at her and saw a body to be tolerated. I looked at her and saw the finest soul ever made. And I was right, and the world was wrong, and I have spent 30 years proving it, and I'll spend whatever I've got left proving it still. To my wife, to Margaret, the greatest of us all. And every soul at that table rose, the foremen and their wives, the grown children who'd learned their figures at her side, the widows with their land, secure the whole valley, that had once mocked her and now revered her. And they drank to Margaret Brooks. And she sat at the head of the table she'd first read ledgers at on a desperate night 30 years before, and she looked out at all of them. All the people who were hers, all the lives she'd touched and saved and shaped. And the heavy woman from Kansas that no man had wanted to marry, understood at last completely and forever the thing it had taken her whole life to learn. She had never needed to be smaller to be loved. She had never needed to be anything other than exactly what she was. The world had been wrong about her from the very beginning. Wrong about her worth. Wrong about her place. Wrong about everything that mattered, and she had outlived its wrongness and proven it false with her own 2 hands and her own clear mind and her own unbreakable heart. And she had built out of the very life they'd all told her she didn't deserve the largest ranch in the West and the deepest love in the territory and a valley full of children who would carry what she'd taught them for 100 years after she was gone. They had told her she was nothing. They had been wrong, and the proof of how wrong they were stood all around her on its feet, glasses raised weeping and cheering her name on the greatest ranch in the West, which the woman nobody wanted had built from the dust, up with nothing but the worth they swore she didn't have. She had been worth everything all along, and now the whole world knew it.